Chapter 41, Hexcarn 13, Dog Day. Chapter Text House Paint Voldemort's wraithly return was kind of a weird non-event. It mostly had to do with the fact that we'd assumed he was already floating around somewhere making more plans to come back. That he hadn't had the better part of a year to work on his next scheme was something of a surprise. The best Dumbledore could figure was that he was fettered somewhere out of the way, and it had only been that knot, and Macnair had a homunculus ready for him after he abandoned Quirrell that he'd been able to come back so quickly after the Philosopher's Stone incident. When I'd evicted him from the school the second time after killing the basilisk, his servants had lost track of him. The Order was staking out Nart's estate, but they'd apparently set up somewhere less obvious. On getting back to the school, I found out that Theodore Nott hadn't gone home for the break, and he admitted his father had told him to stay at school and hadn't been forthcoming with information since the winter holidays. It seemed pretty obvious that Mavra must have shown up with Black in tow after my encounter with them on New Year's, and they'd worked out a way to get their incorporeal master back. Maybe they were making another creepy baby to house him instead of the snake. Remus had a bit of a crisis when we passed on that Black claimed that Pettigrew had been the traitor. It had to be strange to spend over a decade mourning a dead friend and reviling a living one only to find out that he'd had it backwards. Without the shard of Riddle's soul egging him on, Black might have successfully apprehended Pettigrew instead of eating him, and the previous years might have gone very differently. Of course, if the shard hadn't affixed itself to Black, there was no telling where it would have gone. The information made our tactical goals more confused for the next time we encountered the haunted animagus. Previously, if he managed to die, that was basically as good an outcome as exorcising him. Now we had to figure on attempting to save him if it was at all possible. Privately, I figured the guy had sounded unsalvageably crazy, so I resolved that I wasn't going to risk anyone's life on taking him in alive. But if Remus was there for the confrontation, I worried any fight could go pear-shaped when he started taking risks that were just as crazy as his friend. After his initial annoyance at Nart, Lucius Malfoy seemed to decide that his family hadn't actually been in much danger. If I hadn't stumbled on the Death Eaters making their move in the lobby, they might have been content to sneak off with none of us aware that Voldemort had returned. They couldn't have predicted the narcissistic Dark Lord would make his entrance through the damned movie screen. And without Malfoy's influence, there was no way the Ministry was going to treat the Wraith as anything more than another weird side effect of former Death Eaters and hostile vampires at large. The Ministry was happy to pursue known enemies Sirius Black, Barty Crouch Jr., and Mavra the Black Court Vampire, but they were much less interested in identifying wealthy widower Cantankerous Nart or admitting that Dark Lord Voldemort was still on this mortal plane. As was common with spring break, when there wasn't a monster terrorizing the school, a lot of students hadn't bothered to go home. Once Mathilda and I had been returned for a couple of days, several of our friends started to agitate for Enchanting Club. We'd let it slide for the year, meeting fairly infrequently, because most of the original attendees were firmly in actual Ancient Runes class. But the exams for that were coming up, and everyone wanted some time to pick each other's brain while doing a group project. What I hadn't expected was the group project they'd picked. Wasn't that in my room? I asked, regarding the portrait of me that Filch had provided as my Christmas present. I grabbed it, Percy explained, after everyone suggested it. My family library has some books on magical art, Luna added. Mr. Filch really has done the hard part. Finishing the enchantments should be well within this group's capabilities. But I don't need a talking portrait, I argued. It doesn't actually start talking until you die, Harry, Hermione countered. And you keep getting so close to that. We kind of like you around in portrait form to talk to if you manage it one of these days. Thanks for the vote of confidence, I said, sardonically. Not that it wasn't accurate. Penny turned one of Luna's family books to show me a ritual matrix. I'm interested because it's remarkably similar to soul magic. I boggled. I definitely don't want my soul trapped in a painting. Are all the portraits souls? She shook her head and explained, no, it's similar, but not trapping your soul. There's both a tether to your mind to allow your memories to imprint on the object, and the magical construct that allows it to retain these memories and personality in the first place. They're not really even sentient, but the spells that allow an inanimate object to talk are very similar to Soulfire. The twins shared a look, and George asked, "What if we had something else that could kind of talk?" "Duplicating it is something we'd be very interested in," Fred concluded. Percy gave them both a calculating look, suggesting, "We could take a look at it and find out." They had an intense, silent twin conference through eye contact and body language, probably considering how much of a knock their brother and his girlfriend were, before finally showing off the not-so-secret map. I hadn't realized that it would also display text insulting people that didn't know how to activate it, and once I caught on to the nicknames of the four wizards who were doing the insulting, I laughed and laughed. If we can't help figure it out, I think I can get in touch with one of the original creators, I informed them, after working out that Mooney, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs would make sense as names for a werewolf, rat, dog, and stag. I might not have made the connection if I hadn't read Remus' books, as well as hearing a few of his stories about the kind of things they got up to when they were students. That got me the twins' attention, and once they demonstrated the full Marauders map, I agreed that it would be a really useful item to duplicate. When activated and expanded, it showed the whole school, or at least the rooms that the Marauders had known about, seemed to update the positions of the ones that moved, and most importantly, showed the location of everyone on campus with their name. Percy was impressed. "I am not sure even the headmaster has anything like this. It would be extremely useful for all teachers to have, and in identifying intruders. And I suppose you have only used it for pranks." I caught his eye before he could say anything he'd regret, and gave him the look I usually gave him when he was about to be too officious. He sighed and said, "I shall not confiscate it, but you may need to make this available if you know whose forces attempt to gain entry to the school." They agreed to that, and we spent a very productive session analyzing the map and planning out the spells for enchanting a portrait. Unfortunately, it looked like the map worked by keying into Hogwarts' complicated ward structure. We might be able to make copies for Hogwarts, but it wasn't clear whether any other locations would have similar capabilities to hook into. I resolved to feel Remus out about it carefully, since he was smart enough to figure out why I might ask about it, and might feel obligated to reclaim it for the defense of the school. Honestly, if I hadn't been supporting Percy strengthening his good relationship with his brothers, I might have argued myself that the thing needed to live full-time in Remus or Dumbledore's offices. Maybe I could obliquely suggest the concept to Remus and get him to come up with making a new copy of his own. For all I knew, he'd already started working on a replacement. Enchanting projects took up the rest of the break, where I wasn't getting roped into studying for newts by my yearmates. I probably should have been spending more effort finding an apartment and a job, but Dumbledore was insisting I stay on the school grounds as much as possible until we found out what new scheme the Death Eaters were planning. I could have left if I wanted, being an adult, but he made good sense. With my luck, I figured they'd just grab me as soon as I was graduated in a few months anyway, but try convincing him of that. There were rumors of a suspicious break-in at Ollivander's wand shop, but the bad guys at least hadn't made any overt moves by the Quidditch rematch the weekend after the break. It was at least nice enough weather for it, for once, with only light clouds and wind and about 50 degrees. I was slightly surprised to find Alexis was first to the stands and cheering her head off for Gryffindor. "What?" "I'm still mad at Ollie, but I want the team to win," she explained, using her wand to levitate a giant house banner above the stands. "You still rooting for Malfoy?" I asked Mathilda. "Nah," she admitted. "If Ginny beats him, he'll have something to prove next year. Really intensify that rivalry until it boils over in furious closet snogging." Both of the tiny star-crossed lovers definitely seemed motivated. With Ginny on the improved broom, neither would be able to claim imbalance in sporting equipment for whichever one got the snitch first. Unfortunately, that imbalance was still in force for the rest of the team, since the Slytherins all had nearly new brooms as good as the two Seekers, while the rest of Gryffindor was on their assortment of more affordable ones. It still seemed really unfair to me. But as much as it had contributed to destroying Oliver and Alexis' relationship, his insane training was more than obvious. The Gryffindor team was simply outplaying Slytherin in a way that was basically unstoppable. The bigger boys on the opposing chaser line had one strategy: clutch the quaffle, bunch up, and try to brute force their way through the line. But the twins were simply vicious, and more importantly, precise with their bludgers. On more than one occasion, the guy with the bigger ball had it taken straight out of his arms by a small metal one. Defending it would have smashed a collarbone or worse. Meanwhile, the girls on the Gryffindor line were constantly in both lateral and forward motion, easily dodging just about everything the other team sent at them. I wasn't totally sure, after 3 years of Oliver trying to explain it, why passing was such a thing, but they did it a lot, and it looked neat. Maybe it was just because if you did it fast enough, the other team had a hard time keeping track of who had it with the distances and speeds involved in the sport. As the score inflated to 190 to 50, what Oliver claimed should have been a regular occurrence finally happened. Ginny and Draco spotted the snitch at exactly the moment that the 150 points for catching it could only barely decide the game, and only then if Draco could catch it before Gryffindor scored another goal. The entire stadium lost it, screaming in excitement as red and gold streaked through the sky against platinum and green. I was even caught up in the moment a bit myself, but not so much that I didn't glance around to make sure that there weren't any Dementors or Animagi lurking. No threats spotted. I turned just in time to watch Ginny clench her fist, what looked to be less than an arm length ahead of Draco's own swiping arm. It wouldn't have mattered. The final score was 350 to 50, since Katie had put through a final goal moments before. But my house lost their minds at the thrill of such a narrow win turned into a blowout. I saw Draco marshal his sportsmanship and shake Ginny's hand before heading off the field, and then we were all getting swept along to the house party to end all house parties. My memories of the party were a little scattered, since Oliver had broken out his stash of fire whiskey after revealing that the scout from the team he wanted to join had signed him on the spot. Percy didn't even object, as long as only people who were at least 17 got hold of it. The younger kids were already knocking themselves out on smuggled butterbeer anyway. The fact that wizarding, soft, drinks for children are mildly alcoholic says all you need to know about the culture. My buzz started to wear off late into the evening, when it was just the really heavy partiers still up, and several kids conked out on the couches instead of in their rooms, including Mathilda sprawled out across me on the couch. What caught my attention was Alexis giving Oliver a small kiss on his cheek on her way out of the room and telling him, "Congratulations, Ollie. I'll be rooting for you in the pros." He sighed wistfully at her as she walked up to her room, as if contemplating his lost opportunity, then said, "G-Night, Harry G-Night, Professor," and headed his own way out. I looked over to see that, as was often her practice, McGonagall had showed up to make sure the party wound down without any injuries or alcohol poisoning. I hadn't really talked to her outside of class since the conversation after New Year's. She regarded me with an unreadable expression, flashes of pain, sadness, and happiness all flickering across her face. Hell, if Alexis and Oliver could make up, and Death Eaters could kill me the first time I slipped up, it was dumb to hold a grudge. "Quidditch Cup in your office 2 years in a row," I offered. "Maybe 3, she allowed. "If I can't convince Albus Quidditch won't be a distraction from another competition he's hoping to host next year. But don't tell anyone." "Yeah. I think we'll get it anyway if Angelina keeps the team even half as trained. Plus, next year, 4 Weasleys on the team. As far as we knew, nobody in the house was even half as ready as Ron was to take over for Oliver as keeper. It should certainly at least keep them all out of trouble." She gave a small smile. "Do you need any help getting Miss Grimblehawk to bed? I think she'll get moving when I wake her." "Hopefully before my leg goes completely to sleep," I joked, though I was getting some pins and needles from where one of her elbows was cutting off my circulation. "But thanks." I decided to extend an olive branch. Do you want to come by the new apartment sometime this summer? We haven't actually found one yet, but we will soon. Hopefully. Percy, Penny, me, and, well, Mathilda will probably be there." I challenged her sensibilities. Her smile got bigger. You'd almost be able to tell she was smiling even if you didn't know her really well. "I'd like that a lot, Hoss." Good, good," I nodded, then joked. especially since you're a transfiguration genius, and none of the rest of us want to try fixing anything that's wrong or painting. That even got a slight chuckle. At the very least, I'm sure I can show your roommates the spells. Good night. My grandmother took her leave as I felt some tension leaving my body for that relationship improving. Next, I just had to deal with other tension in my body, the one that was sleeping peacefully despite her whole weight crushing her arm into my thigh. It turned out, unfortunately, that true love's kiss only woke my girlfriend from magical slumber. Cape Fear I'd missed the previous year's apparition test due to all the fallout of the Chamber of Secrets. Honestly, an apparition license seemed ludicrous on the face of it, considering that with owls completed, and past my 17th birthday, I could cast any other spell that wasn't blatantly illegal without a certificate in hand. The whole thing seemed like a weird nod to Muggle children having to get driver's licenses. But apparently they took it seriously enough that I'd been cautioned that I'd get in trouble if they found out I'd been apparating without one. When pressed, they claimed it was because of the danger of splinching, both to the wizard that was bad at apparating and the statute of secrecy if muggles found wizard body parts lying around. At least, I got to take the test with Mathilda, who'd been studying at all the in-castle training sessions for the past several months. It was interesting to me that Dumbledore could selectively take down the anti-apparition wards in the Great Hall for the trainings, which seemed like a huge security hole since they were scheduled far in advance. But then, for some reason, the final test near the end of April had to be in Hogsmeade, on a school day, on the afternoon before a full moon. I had Monday afternoons off from classes, but Mathilda and most of the other sixth years were missing their extra-long potions class to take the test. Unsurprisingly, Maeve wasn't present for the testing. She'd probably bribe a private tester later who wouldn't look too closely. When I'd seen the she-red cap teleport the previous summer, it didn't actually look much like apparition. Most of the rest of the sixth years seemed to be there, though I guess if they weren't taking defense with me, I'd be less likely to recognize them. With me and 30 or so other students waiting for their exam in the Three Broomsticks, Dumbledore had at least stepped up security. Remus had gone ahead and cancelled his class with the fifth years for the afternoon, since he was already feeling peaky from his monthlies, but was on hand, sitting at a booth with Tonks. She would probably be a bigger help than him if anything went wrong, but he wasn't completely helpless before his transformation. Since his potions class was cancelled for the test anyway, Professor Belby was also on hand, though slightly late. I'd noticed him hand Remus a flask that was almost certainly his last dose of Wolfsbane potion as he headed in. Moody, also there for security, slid into a chair with his back to the wall at the table where Mathilda and I were waiting for our test. "Been thinking about what you said," he started, without preamble. "Did the research on Muggle private investigators. Might be able to make a go of it. Lot of crimes the Auras don't have time for that people would pay to have investigated to get enough evidence that the Ministry has to look into it. Probably less infidelity investigations than the Muggle world, though." "You might be surprised," Mathilda suggested. I raised an eyebrow and she explained. "I hear things. My father didn't cheat on my mother, but people go to him for advice on getting divorced." "Interesting," Moody considered. "So what do you think, Dresden? Apprenticeship?" I asked. "With pay?" He nodded. "Start out as a quarter share partnership. We can negotiate raising it if you wind up doing more than a quarter of the work." I glanced at Mathilda, who nodded. We'd already talked about it a little after Moody seemed interested when I'd mentioned it to him after the last Death Eater run-in. Tonks had mentioned that being trained by Moody was extremely stressful, but she wouldn't have traded it for anything. I smiled. "Works for me." He nodded and shook my hand, explaining, "I'll get you more information once I get the permits sorted. Speaking of permits, they're about to call you, I think." Sure enough, I was called up next for the test. The actual process wasn't at all hard, as one might expect for a couple of officials trying to get through over 30 people in 2 hours. Apparate into a hoop. Apparate between 3 hoops quickly. Pop over to Honeydukes. Grab a token to prove you've been there, and pop back. Easy. I heard there had often been a longer distance apparition portion of the test previously, but the veil was still fractured, so nobody could do that anymore. Well, nobody that didn't know about the Wraths, and I was still sitting on that information as much as possible. Hundreds of wizards using them as springboards all the time would probably shake tons of monsters out of the never-never across Britain. And then they would have to make a law and wouldn't let me get away with doing it. I finished quickly and decided to wait for Mathilda to finish up before heading back to the castle. They were doing it alphabetically, and there weren't really any E or F last names among the sixth years, so it was only Alora Dunn and Ross gibbered in between our tests. She was just walking back across the inn's common room, waving her signed license card, when there were sounds of screams outside. If I'd been thinking about it, I'd have realized the timing couldn't have been coincidental. 5 more minutes, and we'd have been back inside the school wards. But in the moment, Gryffindor doesn't train you to assume innocence in danger is a trap for you. I was out on the street like a shot, Mathilda right behind, and Remus, Tonks, and Moody following. I'd gotten very efficient at spilling out of the 3 broomsticks for screams over the course of the year. Bold as anything, Sirius Black in his animagus form was just standing in the middle of the road outside of the joke shop, snarling at the rapidly fleeing passers-by, visibly missing one ear where Crouch had splinched it off his human form in their previous escape. He got a good look at me, red eyes flashing, turned, and tore off down the street. If I wasn't expecting a trap before, I was after that. Where were the other Death Eaters? At least it was broad daylight, so there likely wouldn't be any vampires about. Unfortunately, while I was trying to figure out what their plan could possibly be, Remus was shouting, "Wait, Sirius," and charging after his friend. I blamed the stress of the impending change. "Remus, it could be a trap," I shouted after him, but he was already sprinting down the street with moon-powered ferocity. Moody snarled in agreement behind me, but Tonks was also already sprinting off to cover her boyfriend. "Lupin can manage a Patronus, right?" Moody asked, somewhat rhetorically, looking up as the dark shapes of Dementors began to swoop in from whatever shadows they were stationed in near the town, waiting for someone to yell Black's name. "Let's get these people off the street." I heard him mutter, "If that girl survives, I'm going to kill her." With his prosthetic leg, there was no way he was going to keep up in a foot race with an animagus, a werewolf, and an athletic 20-year-old. Instructions from the senior aura helping to restrain our own Gryffindor natures, Mathilda and I summoned patronesses and began to help Hogsmeade citizens back into buildings who'd been caught out. Fortunately, it wasn't a school Hogsmeade weekend, so the only students to corral were already in the inn. The day had been only a little cloudy and not too cold before the Dementors began to stream in, but it got dark and chill as they swarmed. I was grateful to have my Patronus nearby, which made even the mass of creatures easier to deal with. It helped that most of the mass was floating after Remus and Tonks, and I hoped they had the presence of mind to protect themselves even though they hadn't when they ran off. We'd mostly gotten the streets cleared when an adult wizard shouted, "Help!" from nearby. Somehow, he'd caught the attention of 2 Dementors, who descended from the sky and began to follow him as he rushed into the nearby house. "These things are worse than Death Eaters," I swore, charging down the street. Mathilda pelted along behind me with a grunt of agreement. We must have gotten separated from Moody in the confusion. When we got into the house, it was already too late. 2 bodies were unmoving on the ground, the wraithly creatures hovering above them. "No," Mathilda screamed. "Hoc est corpus." She'd had an easier time learning the Sulphur charm than any of the other apologies, possibly because it was simple for her to assemble the proper emotion. The bright blast from her wand filled the living room in fiery, reddish light as it impacted against the first Dementor, turning in what could have been surprise. A tornado of silver sparks whipped through the creature, shredding it like a black rag in a blender. Shadowy substance simply unraveled and evaporated into the light, briefly illuminating a desiccated skeleton within that, itself, crumbled into dust that spun away and disappeared. The second Dementor tried to charge us, but I already had Mouse in position, pressing it into the corner. Mathilda breathed heavily, trying to recover from the powerful magic. Under the silvery light of the Patronus, I had a moment to examine the citizens that had their souls devoured by the creatures. A man and a woman, naked and suddenly familiar-looking, where they'd been concealed behind the Dementors. Perfect copies of Mathilda and me laid on the floor, unmoving. The wizard we'd rushed in to save poked a head around the door of the next room, gave us a manic grin while licking his lips, and tossed a potion into the room. Wait, not a potion, A grenade. I hadn't exactly prepared to deal with a flashbang. In the blast of sound and bright light, I was disoriented enough that I couldn't defend myself, and even the spells on my duster weren't enough to hold up to the barrage of stunners. Hopefully, the others dealt with the obvious trap better than we had. Tight ropes when I came to. It was night, it was cold, and it was windy. I could immediately tell that I'd been stripped of my duster from the fact I was shivering. The smell of salt water and crash of waves suggested I was outside near the ocean. Also, something was threatening to rip my right arm out of its socket, making playing at being unconscious not worth it. Opening my eyes, I could tell that I was sitting on a large boulder atop a cliff. The full moon's light streamed down upon the scrubland to my left and the sudden drop to the crashing ocean to my right. Several large braziers were set up in a circle around the area to provide firelight, though I was far enough from the nearest one that I was still close to freezing beneath the thin white robe I'd been dressed in. I was sitting across a ritual circle from Sirius Black in his human form and dressed in the same white robe. Well, not directly across. The circle was marked into thirds, and the giant snake Voldemort had possessed at the theater was coiled in the third spot around the large diagram. The stupid snake got a brazier close by to keep it warm. A seemingly inanimate, human-sized scarecrow was propped in the middle of the circle and draped in a black robe. Also like me, Black's arm was manacled, though it was his left arm versus my right. I looked up and realized that both of our arms were bound to stout ropes leading up through a pulley system into a complicated gantry that was basically a crane arm or gibbet dangling a structure over the edge of the cliff. The hanging object was a human-sized birdcage, and Mathilda was trapped inside, also dressed in what had to be sacrificial robes. She still seemed out of it. "Yes, you might be able to get loose," Mavra's voice grated from behind me, explaining, "but can you do it without her falling? Between the two of you and the pulleys, you're not quite being dragged down after her. If one of you gets out, she certainly falls to the rocks below." I could smell the grave stench of her breath as she moved closer and whispered in my ear, "A certain she-princess was willing to pay me extra to ensure she dies, but if you're good I'll just make her into a new child to replace some of those you've denied me." "Even if you could get out," Crouch added, manner jolly as he emerged from behind one of the braziers, "we've taken all your gear. Had to leave it on the body doubles to sell the bit." I doubt Moody will be fooled for long, but a few hours of confusion is enough to cover up an abduction quite nicely. Had you even have time to switch our clothes without him catching you? I wondered out loud, while furiously trying to figure out how I was going to escape from my regularly scheduled annual death trap. He explained gamely, "It's not like undressing charms are hard," and not popped his head around a building and let Mad-Eye chase him for a minute. "No names." Not shouted from down the hill, probably working on whatever ritual they were using. "It's not like your identity's much of a secret at this point, old bean," Crouch chided. The snake hissed, and he apologized. "Yes, master, sorry. Just explaining to Dresden why he shouldn't try to escape." For some reason, my left hand hadn't been bound, which seemed like an oversight, and I used it to confirm my belt, vest, and amulet were missing. That gave me cover to use my bound hand to feel that my ring was still in place. It wasn't super shiny, the runework was subtle, and it wasn't really enchanted. It was a focus, so they may have missed that it was a threat in their hurry. Hopefully, they'd missed Mathilda's as well, but at the very least, I'd be able to send a message to our friends if I could figure out where we were. The cage Mathilda was in really wasn't much more than enough metal wire to keep her from squeezing out without them being able to drop it or stun her before she could escape. After all, too much weight on the thing, and it would just drag Black and me over the edge anyway. As emaciated as he was, Black probably didn't weigh much more than Mathilda. That gave me a few options to get her out quickly. A simple cutting charm might manage it, and I was good at doing those wandlessly. "Tell Remus I'm sorry," Black babbled in a moment of semi-lucidity while I planned. They'd finally trimmed down the rest of his hair and beard, making his missing ear more prominent. "I didn't realize he was there. You told him I was innocent, that it was the rat. I tried everything I could to let him catch me back at the village, but I have no control when I'm Padfoot. We got away from him. And my little cousin Nymphadora." "Yeah, that's her." and Remus feels really bad about thinking you were the traitor all those years," I assured the possessed animagus. "Just try not to transform, and maybe we'll all get out of this." "Good old Siri will be fine," Crouch chuckled. "He's going to live a long, safe life." "Why didn't they call you last year?" I needled Crouch. "You're McNair's replacement in this whole deal, right? Does it hurt that you only got read in when he got blown up?" "I trust the master's wisdom," he shrugged, though he flicked his tongue over his lips in what could have been annoyance. "Fewer people involved means fewer chances of capture. No one could have expected you to be such a persistent hindrance. But third time's the charm, right? I think this is technically 4 if you count the first possession attempt," I argued. "Not an auspicious number. Better let us go and try something else." He chuckled. "I like you, Dresden, shame. What's going on?" Mathilda groaned, waking up in the cage and getting her bearings. She was far enough over the edge of the cliff that she was really only visible by the flickering firelight reflecting off of her robes and the moon shining on her hair. I was caught for a moment in worry and fear. This was exactly what I'd been afraid of, getting involved with her. Another person for the bad guys to take away. Another resurrection attempt. "They used guerrilla warfare to capture us," I hinted, hoping she was coherent enough to work out that I was making escape plans. She cursed quietly in Welsh as she realized the predicament she was in, testing the cage and making it sway enough that Black and my arms were jolted. "Sorry," she said, catching how our obedience was being enforced. I thought I spotted her eyes widen in surprise as her thumb flickered over her hand, which I took as evidence that she'd also kept her ring. I was having a hard time coming up with a workable plan. I didn't think they were stupid enough not to put up anti-apparition jinxes. This site might even be a permanent enough ritual space to have wards. The hillside below would be a shooting gallery if we tried to run that way. Maybe the wards didn't extend all the way down to the water, but trying to apparate midair wasn't exactly reliable in the best of times, and the consequences for failure were pretty great. Sticking charms were another thing I'd used a fair amount without needing a focus due to my crafting work, but temporarily affixing a couple of pieces of leather to each other was a lot easier than freezing a pulley system long enough to cut myself and Black free, and then retrieve Mathilda. If they just left us alone, it would be no problem. And of course, any one of Nart, Crouch, Mavra, or the Voldemort snake would probably be dangerous to me, even if I was fully armed. Speaking of armed, I was surprised to see my unicorn horn focus in Nart's possession as the masked Death Eater trudged up the hill and into view. If I could get hold of that, I could exorcise the snake. He had it placed on a tray that also included 2 wands, some parts of ritual components, and a small wooden box covered in sigils. The whole process was being treated gingerly, even more than I'd expect from an old man in the cold outdoors. Maybe I should just try a banisher to knock the stuff into the ocean. "I'll stop you if you raise that hand," Mavra explained, still lurking behind me. I could hear the smugness in her voice as she explained, "Your heartbeat increased. It's almost as good as reading your mind." Right, new step 1 was hoping I could knock a super strong, preternaturally fast vampire off the cliff behind me before trying anything else. I was really upset they weren't underestimating me nearly as much as they had the previous year. Even despite the chill, I started to sweat a bit. I wasn't sure how I was going to get out of this. "The ritual of 3 by 3, Nart began to intone, setting down the tray of items on a small table outside of the circle and withdrawing a pot of salve. 3 come to the circle. The most loyal servant." He dabbed a bit of the green ritual paste on the snake's head. "Figured that Voldemort didn't have any real friends. The enslaved foe." He walked over and daubed on Black's forehead as Crouch held his head to keep him from squirming away. "And the recalcitrant enemy," he said, daubing my own head as Mavra's vice grip held it in place. With both of her hands on my head, she couldn't exactly stop my left fist from flying free at the old man. He managed to twist so I didn't get him in the gut or the groin, but I felt like the crack I felt was his hip and not my hand. He snarled in pain as Mavra moved one hand off of my head to grab my arm, and Mathilda hissed as the jostling made her cage shake dangerously. "You're sure you need him alive?" the vampire asked. "This is risky." "For now," he allowed, limping back around the circle to his tray and picking up the 3 foci. 3 wands, all with cores from the same phoenix for rebirth," he explained, voice less certain from the pain. The master's old wand, badly burned, he explained, placing a wand that was little more than charcoal in front of Black. Someone must have recovered it from the house Snape had burned Voldemort alive in. The enemy's wand, too pure for this mortal world, he scoffed, setting my focus down in front of me with great wariness, though Mavra still held me in her rotting embrace. At least she was wearing robes, so it wasn't much skin-to-skin contact. And a new wand, for a new dominion, he finished, placing a slender wand that was maybe 11 inches long, and I guessed, made of holly in front of the snake. I figured I now knew why they'd robbed Ollivanders. It was at least small comfort to see that having to keep kneeling to place the foci was further messing up Nart's injury. Maybe he wouldn't be mobile if I could bring it to a fight. I kind of regretted the gesture, though. I probably should have used my shot to fire a cutting charm at the scarecrow in the middle of the circle, which was likely packed full of all kinds of gross stuff for Voldemort to use to form a new body. Finally, the 3 anchors, Nart began. My lord, if you would remove yourself from Nagini. The snake flinched as the smoke of Voldemort emerged from its body and hovered in wraith form above the circle, just over the scarecrow. 2 are already in place, and only 1 more remains, he said, flipping open the ring box to reveal an oversized, shiny gold ring set with a black stone that would have been uncomfortably large to wear, even for a signet ring. My lady, if you would take it, he asked Mavra. The curse only applies if you put it on, she disagreed. And I need to keep hold of Dresden. She wasn't wrong. If she'd released either hand to take the ring, I'd have gotten enough mobility back to do something about it. Practice your occlumency, Nart, Crouch suggested, flippantly, from where he was still making sure Black didn't try anything. It's only a death curse if you succumb to the compulsion and put it on. Well, I didn't like that at all. Fine, Nart agreed, treating the ring box like a live grenade as he walked it over to me. Mavra wrenched my left hand up toward him, but she couldn't both control my arm and bring her strength to bear on my fingers. The old man certainly didn't have the strength in his palsied hands to pry my fist open, especially when he had to be so careful of the ring. I was just winging it, trying to stall out the ritual. While she could only control my arm, Mavra's strength was too much for me to even think of shoving her away or knocking the box off the cliff. He'd started when the full moon had been highest in the sky, so I might only have to hang on for a couple of minutes. Voldemort's wraith had a better view of the proceedings, and was the one that had been there every time I'd messed up his plans previously. With a wavering sigh of spectral annoyance, he ordered, Crouch, kill the SS Spare. Yes, master, Crouch agreed, and then cast a negligent defindo to sever the ropes holding Mathilda's cage to the gantry. She screamed as she plummeted, and in my own scream of anguish my fist went slack enough for Nart to pry it open and slam the cursed ring onto a finger. And then I blacked out from the pain of the curse that began to mummify my hand alive. Chapter 42, Hexcon 14, Bird K. Chapter texts and body. Despite blacking out from the pain, I wasn't out for long. When a ritual starts to drain you to revive a lick, unconsciousness apparently isn't an option. Green light rushed down my arm to my rapidly blackening left hand. I assumed the light came from my head since Black was, similarly, glowing from the mark on his brow. It moved through the ring that had been shoved onto my hand, where it picked up a web of black soul energy before leaping into the focus at my feet. Black and the snake, already Horcruxes, just immediately added the black webs as the energy directly leaped from their heads into the wands before them. In hindsight, I may have gotten off a little bit easier than they did. The non-dominant hand is usually used for absorbing magic and erecting shields, not projecting magic, at least in the way I was taught. The energy pathways out of my right hand were much more developed. At the very least, the green glow I was producing seemed a little less than what the other 2 were generating, from what I could tell through the pain. The energy earthed itself into the phoenix-gored foci and flowed along the ritual diagram's lines into the scarecrow green light, seemingly somewhat purified of the Horcrux taint by fox feathers. Nart was busily chanting in Latin, and I picked up words referring to resurrection and rebirth over the suddenly heavy winds. Mavra and Crouch had let go of us rather than get caught in the ritual, but my body was paralyzed by the pain such that I couldn't really think about escaping. I wondered if I'd have the strength after it ended, or whether this was going to drain me dry. If I'd lost Mathilda and failed to prevent Voldemort from getting a new body, was there really even a point to me trying to escape? The driving, bitter wind was caught in a tornado that spun within the ritual circle, the rest of the diagram on the stone lighting green traceries to balance the power being drained into the scarecrow. Wrapped in the majority of the light, the figure's face began to transform from simple leather into flesh, and it filled out into a much more humanoid form beneath the black cloak. Though I was trying hard to do something, I wasn't able to interfere, and within a minute the wraith floating above was caught in the light like one of the traps in Ghostbusters, pulled into the body. Not long after that, the process completed in a flash of green brilliance. Suddenly, the night was still cold, but the winds had all but ceased. The process racking my body ended, allowing me to slump to the ground, exhausted but not dead. Newly embodied, Voldemort pulled down the cowl of his hood to observe his few followers. Long black hair framed a face that would probably be handsome if not for the fine, pale but green-tinged scales that he had instead of flesh, lack of any appreciable nose, and glowing red eyes. It was hard to tell from the ground, but he might have gotten some of my height, since he seemed to tower over the Death Eaters. "Wand," he demanded, and not painfully bent down to retrieve the new wand in front of the snake, offering it with both hands to his master, hilt first. Voldemort swished it, and green sparks emerged. "It will do. A close enough match until I can find a superior option." "Hey, you fixed the lisp," I needled with a groan from the ground. No reason not to piss him off, since he was going to kill me anyway. "Try. She sells seashells by the seashore." "Crucio," he tossed off absently, causing my body to rack in agony for a mere moment. It honestly distracted from the pain in my cursed hand, so wasn't too bad. "Indeed, a suitable wand. Oh my, Dresden, that hand looks awful. You should get that looked at." "Great, the guy may have gotten a touch of my sense of humor as well. He addressed not. Speaking of which, my memories in my spectral form are not perfect. Clearly I directed you to the ring when a third anchor was required, but why did you not simply use the locket housed beneath us?" Crouch looked a little green, either in fear or remembering an ordeal. "It had been replaced with a forgery, master. It seems Regulus Black betrayed you before his death." "Regulus," Black managed from where he had sprawled on the stone across the circle. "My brother didn't die a Death Eater." "Ha!" Voldemort schemed. "Then we shall have to direct Sirius to search the Black Estates for evidence of whether he managed to destroy it, or Bella when we make contact if the dog is too addled to adjust the wards." "Should we summon them, master?" Crouch asked, rolling up the sleeve of his black robe to show his evil cattle brand and offer it to his boss. "Soon, but not immediately. First, gifts for my truest followers." Turned to Mavra and asked, "My lady of the line of Drackle, we appreciate your assistance in this matter. What is it that you'd like in repayment?" "I was going to take the girl, but you dropped her off a cliff," Mavra complained, apparently not cowed at all by the reborn dark wizard. "She had spunk. Let's just say, give me first refusal on any of your captives that are similarly useful before you ruin them. I've lost 3 children in nearly as many months due to this operation." "Very well. I apologize for the loss of the young one, but it's safer for us all if Dresden doesn't have anything to fight for." He smirked in my direction. "Now, Bartemius, what would you have?" "Only to be truly elevated to the inner circle, master," Crouch knelt. "Of course. You were on your way before the war, and your faith does you credit." He did something complicated with his wand to summon a new silver Death Eater mask like Nott was wearing, and passed it to the kneeling wizard. "Rise, and be one of us." "And finally, Cantankerous, my most faithful, without you I would still be trapped in the darkness between worlds. What would you have?" "Your return to lead us once again is all that I require, my lord," he bowed. "You see, Dresden," Voldemort monologued, "my followers may be diminished, but they are true. They understand power and that it is mine to grant. I have conquered death, and now I must finally conquer prophecy." Well, that sounded like a setup for murder if I'd ever heard one. And I released the cutting charm I'd been silently building into my right hand, snapping the rope and using the release of tension to fling myself to my left, away from Mavra and out of line of any spells. I managed to snatch up my apologies focus on the way across. I vaguely thought that I might manage to kill or exorcise the snake, at least, or take out Nott. Petrificus totalis. Voldemort snapped out quickly and without apparent effort, nailing me with the body-bind curse before I'd made it 2 yards and causing me to slide to a stop just shy of Nagini, who hissed and moved away, not willing to risk being near the subject of her master's ire. You are a worthy enemy, Dresden. I will give you that. Few wizards have been as much of an irritation to me as you have been, even at your young age. For that, I shall give you a wizard's death. If it makes you feel any better, only death will free you of the ring's curse anyway, which I can see has already nearly claimed your hand. But first, let's just make sure that you aren't sporting any irksome blood magic protections from your mother, like another child of prophecy who shall remain nameless. He chuckled at his own joke, ran some diagnostic spells, and apparently confirmed to his own satisfaction that whatever happened when he attacked the Potters wasn't going to happen with me. Very well, he intoned, sighting down his wand. Attend, and bear witness to your brother and sister Death Eaters, what happens to enemies of Lord Voldemort, nay, to hostile fate itself when it faces an immortal wizard. Farewell, Harry Dresden, Avada Kedavra. The green blast of the killing curse hit me directly in the chest. Death curse, I died. I'd love to spin a detailed story about the afterlife. Maybe it's like a train station with shining subway cars to take you to the beyond. I could have finally seen my parents, perhaps. Possibly even picked the brain of whatever higher power was behind all my trials and tribulations. Really risked my ticket into heaven by being sarcastic about it. But either you don't get to remember that kind of thing when you come back, or I wasn't dead for long enough to even get the experience. Dying hadn't felt like anything, but being revived felt like a wash of love and power reigniting every cell in my body. I couldn't play dead with how I twitched and my eyes snapped open, but in the time I'd been out, maybe only a few seconds, the Death Eaters had all moved over to the edge of the cliff, wands drawn and ignoring my corpse. Even the snake went to take a look. Black, still tied up and way more out of it than I'd been from the ritual, looked surprised when I sat up, but managed to keep from making a noise. I had a theory about what had happened, and it didn't involve me being immune to the curse because of fate or higher powers. What was important was that I was no longer surrounded, had my apologies focus in hand, and my left hand still hurt, but was no longer being actively and slowly disintegrated. Time to get to work. I managed to roll fairly silently to my feet and hissed out, "Defindo," as I passed Black, cutting his bonds. A few steps past him, I was able to take cover behind one of the braziers. It wouldn't last long, but might help for a second. Not hearing them immediately taking notice, I turned my focus on my left hand, incanted Exscorio, and directed the exorcism charm into the ring on my blackened hand. I figured running around with an active Horcrux on me wouldn't be very good for long, and that the charm might help with any remaining mummification curse energy. Honestly, I had a thin hope that it might also save my hand, which I couldn't exactly move at the time. The wailing of the soul being evicted finally got everyone's attention. The bad guys still had us on numbers, no doubt. My focus in hand might have given me a chance against any one of them, but I was only in a slightly better position than I'd been before I got killed. So I took my shot, whatever energy that had revived me giving me enough stamina to go for broke right after using the tiring exorcism charm. Sighting at Voldemort, I yelled, "Hoc est corpus." As I'd expected, the element of surprise only got me a moment of speed advantage. Somehow the dark asshole had snapped out another killing curse fast enough to have done for me if I'd waited even half a second. What I got was red and green energies colliding in mid-air. Then things got weird. The threads of power propelling the spellfire, normally an invisible trail of ionized air, ignited. As green and red magics destroyed one another, the energy washed backwards, forming a blazing golden rope of energy connecting my focus to Voldemort's wand. My magic was bound to the process, and I couldn't have let go of my focus if I wanted to. Neither could he. Some force with a sense of aesthetics briefly levitated the both of us more in line with the ritual circle, facing off directly across its diameter maybe 4 yards apart from one another. At least I wasn't the one with my back to the cliff this time, and I absently noted Black hiding behind the pulley-decorated post he'd been bound to. Before even Mavra could react, The golden rope threw off dozens of additional threads of coruscating light that surrounded us in a webbed dome centered on the ritual circle. Voldemort's eyes widened, and he yelled at his followers, "Do nothing!" Already off guard at my survival, he clearly didn't understand what was going on. Given a faint undercurrent of fox cry that I heard within the magic that was currently muting the exterior sounds, I suspected it was a byproduct of using foci with matched cores, and I kind of hoped that, since the phoenix was a buddy, I'd have an advantage in this particular test of wills. "Do nothing unless I command it," he shrieked, the phoenix song rising so that even he could make it out. "Maybe you should retire that curse," I yelled across the golden tether linking us. "You're 0 for 3 the last times you've used it right. I'd be interested in seeing what goes wrong the next time you try it." "What have you done? What is this spell?" he snarled. I loved that he was giving me credit for doing this on purpose. As I'd kind of assumed, the connection began to become unstable, the rope modulating from a uniform cord into a wave-like structure, almost like an undulating necklace of beads. "Your return trip to hell," I told him, exerting all my will along the cord. Give him credit, Voldemort was powerful. If he knew what was going on and wasn't under 5 minutes back from over a decade in perdition, he probably would have won the reverse tug of war. But I was highly motivated, and he was off balance. So when I started to push, the beads of force slowly but inevitably moved toward his wand. I smirked as I noticed through the wavering light that the rest of the bad guys were just standing on the edge of the cliff watching. They probably should have gotten to safer ground, but might have been worried about getting around the dome without getting shocked. And that's when a dark-furred arm reached over the edge of the cliff, grabbed Mavra's leg, and pulled her off to plummet into the sea below. Nobody expects the monkey. With the biggest physical threat out of the way, Black found his courage and an objective. "Tell Remus I'm sorry, that I meant something." He shouted at me, then sprinted awkwardly between the edge of the dome and the edge of the cliff. Crouch and Nut staggered back, hesitating to attack their master's Horcrux, and forgetting for a crucial moment that any basic immobilizing spell would have worked to stop the haggard man. They left him a clear path to the other Horcrux outside the dome. I like to assume that Nagini had a really surprised look on her face when Black grabbed her and then leaped off the cliff, aiming for the rocks below. "2 more Horcruxes down, Tom," I shouted over the now thunderous Phoenix song. It was a calculated risk to reveal that I knew what they were, but the shock value was worth it. I did get to see his surprised face. The moment of anguish was enough to slam the rest of the energy home into his wand. What I hadn't prepared for was for the wand to produce an echo of the last, and basically only, spell it had cast. Namely, killing me. Silvery smoke poured out of the end of Voldemort's wand and took my own form. The hairy phantasm regarded me from where he stood next to Voldemort, said, "Well, this is odd," flexed his fingers, and made a pantomime that I read as, "I'll hold him once you break the connection." I nodded and shouted, "Thilda, ready to go." Moments later, the reddish-brown-furred howler monkey swung herself back onto dry land as close as she could get to me without crossing the dome and waited. Resources in place, I yanked my focus offline to break the connection, and I watched my phantom double tackle Voldemort as the dome collapsed into countless golden sparks. By the time Voldemort was screaming, "Stop him!" I was already sprinting downhill, Mathilda bounding onto my back as soon as the dome had fallen. She was much easier to carry and apparate with in her animagus form. Despite the long arms and surprising monkey strength, she was only about a dozen pounds. Crouch and Nut didn't manage to get it into gear before my long legs and adrenaline had carried me far enough across the rocky scrub to feel comfortable trying to apparate. Sure enough, the anti-apparition space wasn't that big, and I twisted in space, just as a couple of spells finally started to streak down the hill at us. As was becoming my signature move, I flipped them both the bird as we disapparated to safety. Whatever coastline we'd been on was close enough to London to apparate into Remus' backyard on the second try, after skittering off a vale crack and landing in the middle of a random cow field. It had been an educated guess that we were closer to the house than to Hogwarts, based on the fact we hadn't frozen to death like we might have on a seaside cliff closer to Scotland. Feeling safe inside the Fidelius-protected house, I firecalled Dumbledore, and we were quickly allowed to flew through into his office. While Dumbledore wanted to debrief immediately, he had to deal with me waving my curse-blackened hand in his face. He seemed more interested in the ring than in my injury, but at least sent us down to the infirmary while he gathered the order. Madame Pomfrey made some very unhappy noises about the wound, but managed to bind it up in potion-slathered bandages that she thought might let me save the hand. Also, I was very nearly magically exhausted. Mathilda was fine other than some scrapes. As soon as Pomfrey agreed I was stable enough, though she'd prefer I stayed in bed, I was whisked back to the headmaster's office. The debrief was intense and involved an ever-increasing number of members of the Order of the Phoenix getting called in. It was like 3 in the morning before someone remembered to give me back my pants. Dumbledore wanted to warn everyone that Voldemort was finally back, but the more political members of the group finally convinced him that wouldn't work out. The Aurors, in particular, were pretty sure all that would accomplish would be turning Minister Fudge against me, Dumbledore, and the school as he tried to stick his head in the sand. I'd been somewhat circumspect about mentioning Voldemort's wraith, so the idea was around in the minds of the ministry. But even with Mathilda to back up my testimony, it wasn't likely to be enough. What they could do was go to the site, which Dumbledore was able to pinpoint based on research he'd been doing into Riddle's early life, especially once I mentioned that it had been a Horcrux hiding place. The scouting team found enough evidence of the ritual left behind to secure the scene, including tracking down the body of Sirius Black and the oversized snake dashed to pieces on rocks below. I was glad that Remus was still locked up in his quarters in wolf form rather than having to go along on that particular mission. The eventual strategy we settled on was revealing that noted boogeyman Sirius Black, known terrorist at large Barty Crouch Jr., vampire of interest Mavra, and an unnamed masked Death Eater, who answered to Not, had kidnapped us as part of a ritual. That part was pretty easy to prove, even if we had to throw Sirius under the bus. The difference from the real story was that they'd created some kind of dark magic homunculus to try to convince people that you-know-who was returned. The hope was that Fudge would go hard against the Death Eaters to try to prove that Voldemort hadn't returned, which would allow those that knew he had to hunt for him. Finally, after the hours-long meeting, which basically wound up with Mathilda as a member of the Order since they hadn't exactly ever asked her to leave, we were sent back to the infirmary, where I was confined to bed rest, and Mathilda was allowed to stay even though she was doing okay. "I thought I lost you," she said from her bed, an arm's length from mine. We'd been in the meeting so late that the room was already growing light from the first rays of the rising sun. "You brought me back," I told her. "Only by accident," she admitted. "I was trying to blast him in the back. I didn't really think about how the rings work. Happy little accident," I smiled. "Penny is going to lose her mind when she realizes we made an actual counter to the killing curse. And did you think you'd lost me when I fell?" "Only for a second," I told her. "Then I realized no two-bit death trap was going to do in Mathilda Grimblehawk." "That's right. Full-price death traps minimum." She deliberately removed her ring from her right hand and placed it on her left ring finger, reaching out across the separation. When my ring clinked against hers, our hands grasping in the dawn light, it felt like victory. Still Liv's defense classes were cancelled on Tuesday. Madame Pomfrey wasn't going to let me out of bed to go substitute teach, even if I had managed to wake up before lunch showed up. And Remus was in no condition to do so after getting the short version of what had happened. He came into the infirmary after Mathilda and I finished our meal to get the full story. The fact that poor, broken Sirius Black had still gone out a true Gryffindor at least made some difference to his mood. I promised him the full memory to view if he could borrow Dumbledore's pensive, and he was heading out, only to remember something and stop at the last second. "You still haven't found a place to live once you graduate, have you?" I shrugged. "Lots of interruptions. Hard to find a big enough place for 4 people on our budget." "With you-know-who back," he began, then suggested, "you can't really stay anywhere without strong wards. Why don't you rent my place? I can keep the rent to what you can afford." "But it's your house," I argued. "I'm here most of the year," he disagreed, "and I can stay with Dora in her flat if I want to get out of the castle during the summer." "Congrats on that, by the way," I told him. Noticed her patronus changed. He smiled. "Yeah, it's going well. Better than I deserve, but I'm trying to deserve her. He chuckled a bit and said, plus, she told me what she let you use the place for on Miss Grimblehawk's birthday. Not sure I could live there after that. He winked to show he was kidding, but Mathilda gasped anyway and I laughed. I glanced at her to check and she nodded. I'll check with Penny and Percy, but I think that would be perfect. Thanks, man. We'll try not to trash the place. I grinned. After he left, there wasn't much to do the rest of the afternoon other than talk and read a bit. I needed a little help maneuvering items with my left hand numbed and wrapped in a huge mitten of bandages. Before dinner, Pomfrey was changing them, and Dumbledore chose that moment to show up and observe. It's not looking bad, the Mediwitch said, after unwrapping and cleaning it. I must have scoffed, looking at the blackened hand, and she said, truly, the spell didn't actually dig all the way through. This would already be healed if it wasn't curse damage. I'm optimistic that time and potions will repair most of it. Can we remove the ring? The headmaster asked, glancing at where the gaudy trinket was still mounted on my middle finger. Not yet, she shook her head. The dark magics were either single-use or seemed to have been removed by Mr. Dresden's charm, but the remaining enchantments on it would make it resist resizing or cutting to get off safely. I don't think they're harmful. It would be worse to try to pull it off with his injuries. Was that hunger in Dumbledore's eyes as he looked at the ring? He covered it with, very well. Inform me when it's safe. I need to research the item as soon as possible, though it has been neutralized. I'm glad the injuries aren't more serious, Harry. With that, he took his leave. Suspicious, Mathilda whispered, and I nodded. Pomfrey rewrapped my hand, fully concealing the ring, and asked if I want to try going to dinner in the Great Hall. Anything to get out of the boring bed, I nodded, and Mathilda promised she'd help with anything I needed two hands for. Honestly, other than my hand, which was comfortably numb underneath the salved bandages, I wasn't doing that badly in the injury department. I've been much more banged up in most of my previous fights with Death Eaters. Altogether, I'd really only taken a half-hearted torture curse for a moment, and the killing curse, it turned out, was a painless way to go. I wasn't planning to make a habit of getting hit by it, but as post-battle hangovers went, it wasn't bad. The rumor mill was going crazy, and we were mobbed at dinner. The morning newspaper wasn't really set up to make it to print on Auror investigations that happened in the early AM, but I suspected I would be dodging Rita Skeeter for a long while. Dumbledore had apparently mentioned a little bit about what had happened to the breakfast crowd, mostly just to say that the Dementors would be removed from the school and that the rumors of my and Mathilda's attack by the creatures had been exaggerated. It turned out that Moody hadn't been fooled by our body doubles for even a minute, and had transferred them back to the comatose muggles that they'd been originally. They still hadn't been able to track down where we had been kidnapped to in time, but managed to return the poor pair back to the long-term care ward in Glasgow they'd been taken from by the Death Eaters. We spent most of dinner, and then a huge amount of time in the common room after dinner retelling the story. While we weren't officially claiming that Voldemort was back, we weren't going to keep it quiet from our friends and allies either. The Muggle-born, especially, needed as much warning as they could get. I was fully ready to take a real shower, with my bandaged hand safely bagged so it wouldn't get wet, of course, and then collapse when I finally got back to my room, only to be surprised by my own voice saying, "Well, that's unexpected." On my nightstand, the small enchanted portrait of me was looking up from his work at the enchanting table where Filch had painted me. He looked as surprised as I was. It took me a moment, and then I said, "But I was only dead for a few seconds. Guess it counted," he boggled. How much do you remember?" I asked. "It's fuzzy after you got hit by the flashbang," he admitted. "Another Voldemort ritual. He's back. Hit me with the killing curse, but then Mathilda got me with the Sulphur charm. We got away after that," I summed up. "Ha," he nodded, taking it in. "I'm glad you're not dead. Not sure what it means for me. I don't think I can go back to sleep. Wonder if I'll get more memories in the meantime, or even the next time you die. We'll put Bob on it, but I need a shower," I promised my own portrait. As weird things went that had happened to me, having my own artificial intelligence barely even rated. That wasn't the only thing I consulted with Bob about over the next couple of days. I owed the skull so much pornography for the information he'd given me about what was going on. The bandages finally came off for good on Friday evening. See, not so bad. Madame Pomfrey explained, carefully debriding the blackened skin off to reveal some fairly gnarly scar tissue. I tentatively flexed my fingers, and they seemed to mostly work. The feeling in my hand wasn't great, but that could just be the potions having a lingering effect. I think you'll get back most of your mobility and feeling. The scarring should also fade, she promised. You just need to give it time. Unfortunately, magic healing doesn't work well on curse wounds. A warning, though. That hand may be hard to heal magically going forward. Try not to seriously injure it again. Thanks, Doc, I told her. She grinned, apparently amused that wizards from the Muggle world thought of her as a doctor. I stopped by the Gryffindor common room for a bit before heading over to the headmaster's office. He was eager to talk to me after I was cleared medically, and I knew why. Lemon drop, he offered as I took the seat across from his desk. Thanks, I told him, taking one of the candies. I absently made a mental note to get him an assortment of Muggle candy for the next Christmas. Before he could spend time getting around to the topic I told him, I gave the ring to Hermione. His eyes widened. All he could get out was, "Why? You already gave Ron the cloak," I shrugged. "And she's the only one I trust with it that doesn't have a loved one that died. She'll use it for something good. Probably spend her time summoning up great thinkers of history for advice. Not like we'd use it." Bob had no trouble at all identifying the stone in the ring as one of the Deathly Hallows. It was only that it was wrapped most of the time that had kept my willpower strong enough to not use the device that could summon the shades of the dead. Bob was also very clear that the stories of most users committing suicide to join their loved ones within a few years of obtaining it weren't exaggerations. I continued, in the face of the headmaster's shocked face. It was all I could do not to instantly call up my parents. Check to see if my ex was actually dead. "Sir, how long do you think you'd last if you could talk to all the people you must have lost?" His eyes starting to water, he said plaintively, "I've sought it for so long. If you have questions for someone, run them through Hermione. But if you want to talk to someone, well, sir, Voldemort's back. We need you now. You know where it is when this is all over if you can't wait any longer." He let out a shuddering breath and thought about it, finally nodding. "I can wait a while longer." If you can resist, so can I. He took nearly a minute to pull himself back together. But beyond its primary use, with the cloak and the stone together, I pulled my mother's amulet from out of my shirt and ran my thumb over the symbol of the Deathly Hallows. "You should give the wand to one of the kids, too. I'm not sure if it should go to Seamus or Neville. Seamus would suck with it, but it would probably hold up to his power better than a normal wand. Neville has power issues, and it might amplify him up to a normal wizard's level of strength." "When did you figure it out?" he asked, laying his wand, the third Deathly Hallow, on the table. The Death Stick, the Elder Wand, the Wand of Destiny, I'd suspected for a long time. Was pretty certain after my research this week. "You got it from Grindelwald, who got it from Gregorovitch. It's not that hard to figure out if you know where it is now." Honestly, Bob had been a huge help. I had an unfair research advantage. "It's not unbeatable," he explained, "but it certainly is able to channel immense amounts of power. Why do you think it should go to one of the boys? Maybe Neville isn't the chosen one, but you were treating him like he was when you gave Ron the cloak. A kid who wants nothing more than to be seen, and you gave him perfect invisibility. He won't abuse it. The same reason I gave Hermione the ring. She'll use it, but won't be consumed by it. And might as well complete the set. We don't need a master of death, but we may need the kids you've been grooming to fight Voldemort since they were 11 to have weapons he doesn't know about." "You've given up hope of winning against him," Dumbledore sighed sadly. "He already killed me," I reminded him. That drew a shocked breath, and he got out, "And either must die at the hand of the other. Oh no, the prophecy is finished." He hadn't exactly told me that part, but it checked out. Honestly, I figured he'd be extra careful to take me out first, and with overwhelming force the next time we run into each other, I explained. "But if I also don't have the prophecy going for me anymore, maybe it'll be Neville that does him in after all. He won't expect it, after all of this, but he'll have to chuckle at the irony if it happens." With another long consideration, Dumbledore nodded. "This is honestly ideal. I'd always worried that the subject of the prophecy might lose. The prophecy protected Tom as much as it did the chosen one. Now he's vulnerable to anyone, and you didn't even stay dead. And he's got a lot of enemies. Fewer friends than he thinks, too," I thought out loud. I wondered if he'd tried to call his minions yet, and whether Malfoy and my godmother had answered. And he's down to probably 2 Horcruxes. Dumbledore nodded along, but corrected, possibly 3, as he didn't mean to make the one that attached itself to Sirius Black. We'll have to work hard to figure out what those are, and quickly. I only fear that, knowing that he's lost 4 and that we know about them, he'll move quickly to secure the rest. He doesn't know where the one that Sirius brother stole is, I remembered. It was supposed to be in a cave or something underneath where they did the ritual, and the ring was probably the next easiest one to get to. He might not have that easy of a time recovering the others. I'll mobilize the order, he agreed. And this might be an ideal first case for you and Alastair once you start your private aura's business this summer. I joked in narration. It all started with a dame. Chapter 43, Hexcon 15, Final Notes. Chapter text thrice cursed ultimately. We weren't officially saying that Voldemort was back, but there was no way the Ministry could ignore that Death Eaters were running around doing rituals and kidnapping people, somehow involved with noted Azkaban escapee Sirius Black. Abraham Grimblehawk was a respected official. Multiple auras had seen things they could testify to independent of whatever I'd seen or Dumbledore claimed, and the only reproachable thing Mathilda had ever done was fall in love with me. Which is probably why the Death Eaters didn't try to stay quiet for longer. About 2 weeks after the ritual, the channel opened between Britain and France. It was a pretty significant milestone for transportation, and doubtlessly pulled off a fair amount of wizarding attention to make sure undesirables weren't crossing onto the continent through the new tunnel. After all, the Ministry understood how to monitor boats, and planes were pretty risky for dark wizards, all things considered, but a disillusioned wizard could just walk down the channel in a worse case. Making sure their protections were working took attention. Evidently, it took attention that should have been on Azkaban. The Death Eaters hit the prison during the first guard shift change, bold as brass, first thing in the morning on the Friday. They managed to delay the boat with the morning staff and just float across, as if they were the replacement for the weary guards that had just gotten off the graveyard shift. It turned out Crouch had always had a flair for impersonation, according to Dumbledore, and used it more often than not. Most of the Dementors that had been in Hogsmeade were still on the long way back. Those that were still at the prison reportedly just let Voldemort right past. Well, that was at least the operative theory, since none of the guards had survived. While the worst of the Death Eaters that survived the war had never even gone to Azkaban, he managed to add a stout handful of likely insane prisoners. Names like Rookwood, Travis, and Darlohov were back on the at-large list, as well as a bunch of other hard cases that hadn't fought in the previous war but were likely going to fight in the next. It made for a tense run-up to finals in the castle. Especially among those taking owls and newts, the stress of studying plus the fear or magical terrorists meant everyone was constantly on edge, ready to snap. It didn't hit too close to home, since I wasn't that concerned about my finals and already expected to be a target, while Mathilda didn't have a major test and figured her family was only in a modicum of danger compared to everyone else's. Perhaps the biggest blow-up was Hermione, who was always tense around finals, and one night had to be tackled by her friends and forcibly invited to spend the summer with her friends, behind their wards, with an emergency portkey for her parents. I didn't think she was really even on the Death Eaters lists, honestly, unless Voldemort still remembered that she was vaguely involved in the Philosopher's Stone incident. I managed to corral Draco and Theodore, not when I subbed for defense class late in the month, to find out what they knew. It's tense in Slytherin too, Draco admitted. But Maeve is pretty cool about the whole situation, so the people we'd expect to be making noise mostly aren't. Interesting. If my godmother was to be believed, which wasn't a given, the Winter Court wasn't in any way allied with Voldemort. Other than Maeve sixing Mavra on Mathilda, a deadly triangle of M-names, I couldn't point to anything that even connected them other than Bellatrix and Lucius' former allegiance. So no special house guests this summer, I asked the boys. Just Theo, Draco nodded at his friend. Apparently my house is under heavy surveillance, the taller, dark-haired boy allowed. My father indicated that he didn't expect to be there at all over the summer and that I should find alternate accommodations. I nodded. Order had been watching the Nata state for a while, and the auras in the group might have even gotten official dispensation after the breakout. That still left a ton of potential houses for Voldemort to set up court in. If he thought to cast the Fidelius, he might even be holed up somewhere that none of us could even remember we should be surveilling. Glad you've got someplace safe then, I told him. Fun summer plans. The Quidditch World Cup, Draco nodded. Assuming nothing goes wrong to cancel it. I sent them on to their next class, but had been reminded of Maeve by the discussion. I'd been talking to Barb and getting a crash course on she legal issues. I dismissed my last period early and caught her before she could get back into the building after her herbology class. Harry, she acknowledged, waving her posse ahead so we could speak privately in the middle of the yard. It's rare that you seek me out to talk. What do you wish to speak about? Attacks, I said. The Death Eaters. She raised a perfectly thin white eyebrow. No, yours. That got her attention, and I continued. The way I figure it, you've attacked Mathilda Grimblehawk 3 times. An interesting tally. Enumerate them, she suggested. First, last year in the library, when you used your aura against us and your feud with her began. I called it an attack, and you didn't disagree at the time. Second, at this year's New Year's ball, in front of half the ministry and your allies. Third, when you set Mavra the Black Court vampire to try to kill her, by Mavra's own admission. Do you deny any of these attacks? She seemed to have forgotten that the first one had been labeled an attack and was surprised I knew about Mavra. And if your count is accurate, she allowed. 3 attacks, all bested. By the Unseelie Accords, you must put aside the grudge or declare war. I triple-checked. And if I understand it correctly, now that we're doing this all officially, if you think that Mathilda has done something to earn your ire and reset the counter in the future, you have to tell her and offer terms for recompense before it becomes another feud. She stood there like an ice statue on the sunny, fairly warm spring day, considering. It was uncanny the way she could just fail to move when she wanted to. Finally, she tried. And how would you prove any of this, or pursue it as more than a schoolyard rivalry? I shrugged. Pretty sure if I made the accusation under the Unseelie Accords, and you indicated that your actions weren't covered, or that you aren't a member of the Winter Court, that would set off a whole chain of broken oaths, right? At the very least, there would be questions about why a she was at Hogwarts. Do I have to prove anything? Another few moments of that frozen statue, before her eyes narrowed, and she admitted, very well. Consider Mathilda Grimblehawk safe from my displeasure until such time as hostilities are renewed, with due warning as stipulated by the Unseelie Accords. She tried to marshal her face back into smug nonchalance and offered, keep her. You'll need her to console you with what's coming for you, Harry Dresden. I figured my own smug nonchalance was better as I grinned at her, gave her a saucy wink, and said, thanks, Maeve. You're a real sweetheart when you want to be. If I died right then, I'd at least have her shocked gasp at my audacity to keep me company in the afterlife. I strode off, half hoping she'd curse me in the back. She didn't, and that evening after dinner, when McGonagall was giving out some last-minute transfiguration tutoring, she asked, what is you smiling like that, Hoss? It can't be your toads to toadstools, which still remains slow and incomplete. I poked the still-breathing mushroom and couldn't disagree. Transforming an animal into a fungus was surprisingly more difficult than turning it into an inanimate object, or changing it within the same kingdom. Part of the problem was that part of my brain was always trying to get a perfect Smurf's mushroom house out of the thing, rather than a toadstool that actually existed. Got at least one opponent off my back, I told her. That leaves what, 20,003? Oliver joked from over by his own, subtly croaking toadstool. And 4, I corrected, joking. You have to count Umbridge, even though she's not mean to my face. That woman, my grandmother sighed. Suffice it to say, those of you going into the ministry, well, try to steer clear of becoming entangled with her. I believe she has little involvement with the Department of Mysteries, Percy allowed. His toadstool was perfect, and he was just trying to figure out how to make it more perfect. Though I likely would have been heavily exposed to her on my original career path, my father has said some things I shall not repeat. Is she involved in international magical cooperation? Alexis asked. Unless she biffed her newts, that's the department she was going into, since she already spoke fluent French, and her potion perfume had never really worked to catapult her into becoming the wizarding world's Coco Chanel. It seemed unlikely she'd do badly, since her toadstool was also great. She and Oliver weren't exactly getting back together, but the tension was gone since the Quidditch party. On normal years, no, the professor suggested, but shrugged. This year, perhaps. Between the World Cup and other things, the minister is likely to be more focused on our international relationships. I assumed this was whatever she'd mentioned that might cancel Quidditch the next year. Fortunately, it wasn't my problem. And why did I get a sense of foreboding as soon as I had that thought? On the way back to the common room that night, Filch spotted me across the stairs and motioned for me to follow him. I caught up with him outside his office. "What's up?" I asked. He showed me in, and I realized his office floor was covered in boxes full of bedding. Mrs. Norris slumped tiredly in one of them, with a grey ball of fluff curled up next to her. "One left," Filch explained. "Got Mrs. Figg, a friend of the headmaster's, to take the rest. But this one's too much trouble. Already got loose from my office and got in a fight with something. Got his tail torn off, he did, and came sauntering back bleeding. And he's going to be big, reminds me of you." He unceremoniously scooped up the kitten, already almost as big as his mother, and handed him to me. The fuzzy little beast sniffed my hands, apparently decided that I was all right, and went back to sleep. "And tell that Granger girl to get that menace of hers fixed. Don't think I don't know who the father is. Happy graduation, Dresden." Completely wrong-footed by the unexpected pet, I nonetheless couldn't help but be impressed by the little guy, who might not be little for very long. I smiled and pet his head, thinking aloud, "Well, I call your mom Mrs., so I guess your name can be Mr." Minute detail, the newts were saved until the very last week of the semester. They had to basically be graded immediately, so the graduates could move into their ministry jobs, and that was why it took so long for the OWL grades to come in, even though those tests were finished earlier. It would probably have made more sense to just have newts at the beginning of June rather than the end, but to suggest that would have made my prefect friends stab me at the thought of losing even a moment of study time. June was tense, is what I'm saying. No assurances that Penny and Percy were already guaranteed their jobs. As long as they didn't completely fail, the tests would get through. Alexis didn't want to hear that just being able to speak a second language probably more than qualified her for the International Magical Cooperation Department. There were times I couldn't avoid getting pulled into group study, but when everyone was reviewing separately, Oliver, Mathilda, and I played a lot of fanciful wizarding card games. Since most of the Quidditch team was taking owls and were pretty serious about it, Oliver didn't even have them to hang out with. The lower years uncompressed first, their exams out of the way. This was good, because reports of Death Eater attacks had been growing, and Hermione, in particular, might have lost it if she'd still been stressed about exams as the danger grew. The old playbook of going after Muggleborn was back in force. They hadn't gone after any blood traitor targets yet that anyone had heard about, since the auras were much more likely to show up in those circumstances. But suddenly, after the summer solstice, when owls were just finishing up, the attacks suddenly stopped. With no spy in their ranks, Dumbledore didn't have a clue what had happened and was worried that they were planning something huge. Neither Draco nor Theo had received any information from their fathers. But as the days passed, and Voldemort didn't show up with an army in tow and empowered by some massive seasonal ritual, it got weird. Should people hope that something had put a spoke in the Death Eater's wheel or wait for the other shoe to drop? Newts were at least a distraction from the waiting. I felt like I impressed the proctors with my arithmancy, runes, and defense, and didn't do too badly in my other subjects, getting to drop my biggest annoyances after owls had freed up my attention. Unfortunately, while I knew the charms and transfiguration theory back and forth, they really were biased towards wand users and didn't like it when I had to use ritual circles for the more esoteric effects rather than a simple swish of a focus. Not like it actually mattered in any appreciable sense for my career path, but I wasn't going to actively blow my scores. If nothing else, my grandmother would be sarcastic about it. And then it was all done. There hadn't been any attacks for over a week, so Dumbledore didn't even mind me taking the train back, though there were going to be way more auras on board and waiting at the station than ever before. Nothing but to take one jaunt away from the castle and into adult life. It was even harder for my peers that had been at the school for all 7 years. For most graduates, the time at Hogwarts made up the majority of their life that they could even remember. Suddenly, it was over, and you were just in the world. Wizards didn't even have a real equivalent to college, to ease into adulthood. One day, you have teachers and prefects assigning demerits and hustling you off to bed by curfew packed in with roommates. The next, you're going out to get a job and living more or less on your own. For some of them, they'd never even be back at the school again, except maybe to see a Quidditch match. That wouldn't be me. Unless Voldemort managed to kill me over the summer, I was planning to continue to assist Remus with planning his classes and sub for his post-full moon days. And I'd seen several of my other professors in classes I did well in eyeing me with the consideration of someone who might also want to take a day off from time to time. Maybe my Newt scores would have some use in getting dragooned into a side hustle as a substitute teacher. So, as much as it had worried me throughout the year thinking about last train rides and last times seeing the people I'd come to think of as friends, in reality, it was just a transition from peer to teacher. I'd be at the school often enough that Moody would probably be mad about it, taking away from my investigation work. But still, watching the rolling British countryside as we travelled south, friends jostling in between compartments while my girlfriend nestled in my arms, a new pet cat sprawled across our laps, I realized it was an ending. While I still had any number of people watching my back, and in the same killing curse crosshairs, there was no longer an institution in between me and danger. I don't mean simply Hogwarts, but the entire concept of childhood. Attacks on children inspire action. Attacks on an adult, well, that's illegal, but not the same kind of tragedy. What I wanted in my adult life was a simple little job trying to figure out if there were wizard philanderers and other types that would pay for a little private investigation. While I figured out what it was like to live as part of a pair of couples sharing a house and figuring out how to buy groceries and pay bills. What I was likely getting was years of constantly looking behind me for dark wizards that I'd pissed off too many times. And I still didn't believe that the she-plots were finished with the Unseelie Accords getting renewed. But as the four of us bid farewell to our friends and bundled ourselves through the platform 9¾ flew, and into the house we were renting from Remus, it would keep for a few days. We had bedrooms to decorate, a kitchen to allocate, and a long road ahead of us making sure that Percy and Mathilda could operate the entertainment center. Maybe suddenly being a full-on grown-up wasn't that bad if you had friends to share it with. End of Year 3, Appendix 1. Prolonged apologies. I submitted this as my written extra credit for my arithmancy, charms, and defense newts. My scores weren't broken down precisely enough to tell if they gave me fewer points for it because it was split 3 ways, or if I got full credit on each test. Maybe those proctors don't even talk to each other to notice that I duplicated it, the way the ministry is run. The class of charms nicknamed apologies, to contrast them with the unforgivable curses, can be more accurately termed as spells that use the power of soulfire. Soulfire is itself something of a term of art. It refers to power that is external to the caster, seemingly channeled from celestial realms. This is in opposition to the hellfire that powers the unforgivables, which is the infernal force that makes them impossible to block with magic. Unlike the more common class of spells, both apologies and unforgivables require the caster to achieve a particular mindset that is sympathetic with the energies of the beyond required to enact the spell. Our theory is that this involves attuning one's very soul to the correct dimension through use of this emotion, as evidenced by soulless creatures being unable to cast even unforgivables. But this is a digression for the Department of Mysteries to weigh in on. Suffice it to say that in order to cast any of these spells, the caster must essentially use emotion to create a proper resonance to channel additional energy from outside the inner magical well. The first apology is a well-known charm, the Patronus. This spell, with the incantation Expecto Patronum, summons a silvery positive energy, which in complete use turns into a Protector Imago, but which might only form a shield or even a mist if partially cast. This field tends to uplift the spirits of those nearby and wards off creatures of negative energy, such as Dementors. Fully realized castings, referred to as corporeal, even though they are still intangible, can have a near-physical effect on dark creatures. While it has long been thought that one needs a strong, happy memory to cast the spell, this is a bit of a misunderstanding. The actual emotion involved is the feeling of being safe or of providing safety for others. Since this feeling is often part of happy memories, and so few individuals can manage to cast the spell, it is only recently that the specifics were determined. This emotion of safety feeds the intention of the spell. The patroness is the counterpart to the FiendFyre curse, which also summons an imago in the form of cursed fire. Through investigating the arithmancy of both spells, we were able to isolate the factors that channeled exterior energy and compare them against the three unforgivables. Replacing the hellfire core of the arithmetic diagram with the corresponding soulfire core from the patroness, and updating the interface elements between these cores and the rest of the spell matrix, we were able to create 3 new charms. See the attached arithmetic diagrams. The second apology is the empowering charm, or libertas. It is the counterpart to the domination curse, the imperious, and essentially serves as a counter to that spell and several other mental effects, such as the confundus. Being affected by the charm augments the target's own strength of will, enabling the mind to more easily fight off exterior influence. It also provides a brief rush of confidence. Silvery blue in appearance, and with the incantation libero, the charm requires pride in the target to cast. This may serve to make it less useful as a general prophylactic against mind-controlled subjects entering controlled spaces, as experiments in the last year at the Ministry have determined that the emotion must be fairly strong. Few people, it turns out, are able to summon a meaningful pride in all their coworkers, let alone perfect strangers. The third apology is the exorcism charm, or excoriatus. It is the counterpart to the torture curse, the cruciatus, but does not counter that spell. Instead, the charm directs a scouring stream of energy at the target's soul. This can serve to remove exterior influences, particularly spiritual possession. It does not remove most curses, though it is possible that it can reduce the long-term effects of curses if applied quickly enough after application, research ongoing. Due to its effect of essentially directing a strong current of energy that seeks out cracks between the soul and the spirit of a possessing entity, it also seems as effective deterrent to individuals that, through use of dark magic, have cracked souls. These individuals suffer incapacitating feelings of guilt and shame at their actions, and may be unable to successfully cast curses for a short time after being affected by the spell. Currently, it is unknown what extended exposure would do to a sufficiently morally bankrupt individual. Familiar to Muggles as television static, the stream of spell energy is a dense collection of silver sparks. Its incantation is excorio, and the emotion to cast it is hope. Specifically, this hope is the feeling that the future will be better than today, and that good will overcome evil. To the best of my knowledge, the spell has not been widely tested, as it was only finished a few months ago, but it may serve as a useful non-lethal offensive spell for auras to use on dark wizards. Unlike other incapacitating spells, it is as unblockable as the unforgivables. Finally, the fourth apology is simply known as the Soulfire charm, the counterpart of the killing curse. It does counter that spell if cast quickly enough after death, before the soul has left the body. This spell has only been completed very recently, and our team was obviously unable to test the killing curse except accidentally, which I, myself, was hit by it. Thus, it is unclear what the allowable time limit is to restore a victim of the killing curse, or the peculiarities of how both spells affect targets not considered to have souls. In addition to its ability to revive a target, the spell's offensive application destroys dementors and likely other entities primarily composed of dark magic, e.g. wraiths. Manifesting as a reddish-orange bolt shot through with silver, the incantation for the spell is Hoc Est Corpus. It requires a feeling of love to cast. Those of us that have tested it primarily used romantic love, but familial love and even deep friendship might be sufficient. Likely, the sensation is tied to willingness to give up one's own life for the object of affection, given its ability to call a target back from recent death. The emotion does not have to be felt toward the target, though it may help with the revivification version of the spell. Given the recent defection of the Dementors of Azkaban, it may be as important for Britain's auras to learn this spell as any other. It does not appear to have any significant short-term effect on a living target that is not made of dark magic, but research has so far not been extensive on this subject. Two members of our research team anticipate working in the Department of Mysteries after graduation, so new research is likely to be published quickly as it's relevant to other ministry staff. Appendix 2. Monkey shines Ms. Grimblehawk. Perhaps you could give your account of events. I know Harry was conscious for more of it than you were, but he didn't see it from your perspective and in fact was dead for a moment of it. Of course, Headmaster. Right. I woke up in a cage. It was dark and cold. Someone, probably Crouch, had changed me into a white robe. Wait, that Halia probably saw me naked. Some of us do speak a bit of Welsh, my dear. Sorry, can we get our clothes back, by the way? Been in these robes for hours. Oh, certainly, my apologies. I'll see they're brought up presently. Anyway, I was in a cage. Harry was in the ritual circle. I recognized everybody. I think I could see further down the hill than Harry because I was hoisted up. Not had a little table set up where he was mixing potions. I think the vampire is pretty scared of Harry. She was really close behind him and watching hard. They probably expected him to pull off and escape, even with all they'd done. I figured out pretty fast that my cage had a lot of space between the bars. I could have probably squeezed out even in human form, but that would have tipped them off, and I could see it was a long way down to the rocks below. I didn't want to get dropped on those in a cage. It would be much harder to squeeze out, even if I hit the water and survived. No, on drowning. And we had to stop the ritual, so I knew Harry was going to have to try to do something. I got ready. I was hoping to time it for when they were distracted. But then that big jerk decided to just kill me off. I had never managed the animagus transformation that fast before. Falling to your death is a motivator. Ah, yes, Minerva informed me that you had your breakthrough recently. I asked your uncle to help us file your registration as quietly as possible with the ministry for just such a circumstance where our enemies would not be aware of it. Right. So, in my animagus form, I'm way smaller. I managed to jump out easily through the bars and catch onto the side of the cliff. It's a little harder to climb rocks than trees, but I figured it out. Problem was, I didn't have my wand. Harry's been trying to teach me to do wandless, but I'm not there yet. I was basically looking for a moment I could jump out and bite someone, or steal something, or use my monkey strength to trip someone. Guerrilla warfare, you know, is something funny, Alistair. Very well, please continue. I couldn't figure it out fast enough. They finished. It was like Harry said, you know, who came back all snaky. I'm still figuring out the animal senses thing, but I don't know that he's really human or human adjacent. I think he's basically just driving a dark magic meat puppet, basically. And then he killed Harry and I lost it. The smart thing to do would have been to get away at that point, I know. And I knew that the rings Harry made us couldn't, like, shoot apologies at people. But I just saw red and forgot all that. I'd gotten back onto the edge of the cliff a ways down. They didn't see me in the dark. I changed back to human and tried to shoot the soulfire charm at you-know-who. Hey, it worked on a Dementor. I'm glad it worked out the way it did. I don't think Harry was dead more than a second or two. Glad I didn't burn out the connection on the rings, or that it didn't, you know, go into the wrong person because I wasn't really focusing. After they killed Harry, they put their wands down and got that stance. You know, the whole gloating bad guy thing, so they didn't even notice I was there. They ducked like I was really casting at them. I thought it didn't work, so I went back into monkey form and hid down the cliff where they couldn't get to me. What? Harry? What? I think Harry is worried that wasn't the best tactical choice. Tom is known to be one of the few wizards able to self-levitate sufficiently to approximate true flight. And if Bram Stoker's novel is to be believed, elder Black Court vampires may develop the ability to climb like spiders. Oh, Dracula, right. We skipped that one, but maybe we should get it on video. I think Kerry Elwes is in it. Don't know why they cast mostly Americans for the main parts, though. Keanu Reeves' accent seemed awful from the trailers. But yeah, I went down the cliff, which at least distracted them. Harry did his thing while I kind of scampered away from where I dropped off. Then the whole wands connecting thing and the light show, and I realized Harry had lived after all, or I'd brought him back. I got in position to yank the vampire off when she was distracted. I don't think she died, though. Probably too tough. I bet she's even more mad at me now. I better get one of those jars of powdered garlic. Harry, remember that we need to get a whole bunch for the new flat. Maybe some ornamental crosses. Anyway, then it was time to go. I feel bad for Sirius Black. But I'm pretty sure he got the snake. He was aiming for the rocks when they went past, and that's about it. Thank you. Our next step, I believe, is to send auras to the site. I believe I'm familiar with the location, perhaps Kingsley and Alice for a start. Chapter 44, Holy Grail 1, Sleuth Sayers. Chapter text Dead Eyes, Your stepmom is going to kill me. Mathilda and I had just finished a mid-July showing of The Crow, which had been out for a few weeks, at a cinema not far from Remus' house. Well, I guess it was our house now. My girlfriend and I were renting the place from Remus Lupin, famous teen lit novelist, Hogwarts defense against the dark arts professor, and secret werewolf, with our friends Penelope Clearwater and Percy Weasley. The large suburban home in High Wycombe had two things going for it: access to Muggle amenities and a fidelious charm that kept dark wizards from finding me. It was a bargain at twice the price. But right now, a few miles from our new rental home, all I could think, watching the brutal movie of supernatural murder, was that I'd told Mathilda's uncle that, based on the comic, it probably wouldn't be too bad for her baby brothers to watch. But it was very violent. I thought it was romantic. Mathilda disagreed as we walked through the lobby of the local theater. If we got murdered by bad guys, you come back to avenge me. I think I already did, I told her quietly, my arm draped across her shoulders. Back in the spring, we'd been kidnapped by dark wizards in a successful bid to restore their lick of a dark lord to some form of life. In the process, she'd been dropped off a cliff. I was briefly worried that she had died, and I had technically died myself for a few seconds after the bad guy came back and killed me. I got better. Mathilda had been responsible. Between Lord Voldemort and his many minions, all seeking us for the affront of escaping from their death trap and destroying 3 of his get-out-of-death-free cards on the way out, we probably shouldn't be taking in a movie a couple of weeks after school let out. But when you're 18, out on your own for the first time, and trying to figure out how dating works when you live together, risks must be taken. The dirty little secret was that, while murderous and powerful Voldemort's gang of dark wizard friends, the Death Eaters, were pretty limited in number. Realistically, there were only a couple dozen of them of any consequence, even after breaking several out of wizard prison. If they had the information network necessary to catch us taking in a film at an arbitrary time in a random Muggle theater 30 miles from the only parts of London pureblood wizards ever visited, then we were already screwed. It was little leaps of logic like that keeping me from going insane, being hunted by dark wizards. Also, they'd been surprisingly quiet for a few weeks. Hardly any innocents had been murdered that anyone knew about. I want to know what was up with that dedication. Mathilda said, still talking about the movie we'd just finished. For Brandon and Eliza, one of the other film watchers exiting the theater intruded on our conversation and explained, "You didn't hear. The main actor, Brandon Lee, died during filming in some kind of accident. Eliza was his fiancée." What? No. Mathilda clutched at me on hearing the news. He was so good. We both stopped for a second, considering the enormity of the dark romance underscored by tragedy. No wonder it was still getting crowds, weeks after release. Digesting that news, we stepped out onto the streets of our new neighborhood. High Wycombe wasn't a very big town, but had a college and was midway between London and Oxford, so there was more nightlife than you'd expect from a sleepy hamlet in the middle of a nature preserve. Remus had mostly picked it because of said nature preserve. If he got out on a full moon, he was less likely to accidentally run into people and animal control if he was racing across the fields. But Mathilda and I were more interested in figuring out which of the hole-in-the-wall restaurants was our favorite than in rambling through nature. Technically, it didn't really matter where we lived. The house was 3 miles from the town's shopping area, so we'd apparated rather than walking. While the repeated damage to the Vale from Fey invaders had severely limited the range that wizards could teleport, we probably could have made it to Oxford or a London suburb almost as easily. But it seemed to both of us like part of the experience of living in a place was actually living there. We felt that way even if, due to the fidelious charm cast over the house, Nobody in the area even realized that there was anyone there to be their neighbors. The night's winner for hole-in-the-wall dining was a spicy chicken place that claimed to be some kind of African-Portuguese fusion. It was shockingly tasty and affordable, the perks of a college town for small budgets. My new private investigator business with Alistair, Mad-Eye, Moody hadn't really started raking in the funds yet, but he was paying me, and I still had some income from transcribing superior potions recipes the previous year. Honestly, the biggest trick was exchanging galleons for pounds, since you couldn't exactly pay for a taco dinner with a gold coin. We were just finishing when my ring heated up, and Mathilda checked hers as well. I'd made all my friends a private method of communication for the previous Christmas, but it was a party line rather than letting anyone send direct messages. It was at least quicker and less obvious than using the Patronus, a spectral protector animal that took a lot of skill to cast to send messages, which was the main way other wizards did it. Inside the band, small writing said, "Harry, Ministry Owl for you at home PW." "Late for a delivery," Mathilda commented, having read the same message from our roommate, Percy Weasley. She had her shoulder-length reddish-brown hair pulled back so it wouldn't get in her food, and I smiled seeing more of her face than usual, and that she had a bit of sauce on her nose. "Yeah, I guess we better check it out," I agreed, reaching over with a napkin to clean the spot on her nose that she obviously didn't notice. Owls were the other way of sending messages between wizards, but they were more like the post office than the telephone. One showing up after dark probably meant it was important. At least it had showed up at the house, rather than tracking me down and landing on a table in a Muggle restaurant. Honestly, the particulars of Owl Post were very confusing. Sometimes the smarter owls could track you down wherever you were, unless you set up some kind of spell to prevent them finding you. But mostly, they went to wherever the letter was addressed. But our house had a charm that prevented anyone from finding it that wasn't in on the secret, except it didn't really work on animals. There was probably some extremely narrow conceptual space that allowed an owl to be sent to Harry Dresden's residence and have it all work. I'd have to ask my roommates about it. They were both big brains working for the Department of Mysteries now. The unspeakables of the Ministry's magical research department probably didn't cover the deep secrets of Owl Post as part of new hires' first couple of weeks of orientation, but it was worth a shot. We paid up, found an unobserved alley, and apparated home. Neither of us was nearly good enough at magical teleportation to keep our air displacement to a minimum, so our roommate poked his head out the back door as we appeared with loud pops in the backyard. "Good speed," Percy nodded, his curly red hair currently cut short, round glasses glimmering in the porch light. For the back of the house, the lamp was magically powered, since the wards to keep our magic from burning out the electrical system were mostly on the front of the house. He'd obviously been home long enough to shuck his official work robes and was just in sweatpants and a comfy plain grey t-shirt. Generations of purebloods would be simply scandalized by his Muggle attire. The owl at least let me retrieve the message. It left, so I assume no response was required. You can use Hermes if one is. "Thanks," I told him, walking up and taking the small parchment letter he was offering me. "Think we should get another owl for our mail?" I asked. Hermes was Percy's personal owl and familiar. My own new familiar, Mr. the Oversized Kitten, bumped my leg affectionately as he used the open back door as an excuse to go exploring outside. He was only a couple months old, but already bigger than most full-grown cats, and we'd given up on trying to keep him inside already. He mostly stayed in the fenced backyard anyway so far. He'd probably be out on the nature preserve hunting in no time, though. With an amused smile at the escaping cat, Mathilda offered, "I can ask my parents." Her family was wealthy and probably had owls to spare. "How was work?" I asked Percy as we all walked back into the kitchen through the rear door, leaving it cracked for when Mr. wanted to come back in. "If we told you, we'd have to kill you." Penelope, our other roommate and Percy's girlfriend, called from the living room. I could hear some kind of TV show playing from the front room where Remus custom wards did allow us to keep Muggle conveniences safe from magic energy. "Not that we could tell you, since those oaths of secrecy are comprehensive," Percy added with a smile. The magical bindings would probably just prevent them from accidentally saying something, well, unspeakable, rather than severely punishing them if they answered a question. It was fine. Still a lot to learn, he shrugged, avoiding specifics. He leaned against the kitchen counter, clearly curious about the letter. I obligingly broke the wax seal on the tightly folded piece of mail, a ministry official stamp, and read the letter aloud. Harry Dresden, your presence is requested at the Ministry Aura's office to identify a body. Please attend as soon as possible, after business hours if necessary. Who would you recognize that nobody else would? Mathilda asked, taking the letter from me and confirming what I'd quoted. My heart felt like it fell into my stomach as I came up with the only name that made any sense to me, Elaine. My ex-girlfriend had disappeared after the fire I'd caused escaping her and my former mentor, and I'd never been sure if she'd been caught in it or escaped. She was the only person I could think of that nobody else in Britain would recognize for sure. Mathilda grabbed my hand and squeezed, breaking me out of whatever spiral of doubt and memory I was falling into. I'm coming with you. Percy nodded, and you can contact us if they refuse you entry. I didn't think the ministry was especially mad at me right then, but I had at least one aura who hated me, and we didn't know if any other Death Eaters had infiltrated the government, so it was a good idea to be cautious about weird late-night summonses. We nodded, and I made sure to gear up. I still couldn't really justify taking my staff into the ministry, since that would be kind of like showing up to the DMV with a meaningfully carried shotgun. But I made sure my blasting rod was accessible on my belt, which itself had magically expanded utility pouches full of other useful things, and I put on my room-protected long coat, even if it was a little much for July. Likewise, Mathilda ran upstairs, changed out of her date outfit, and came back down in her official internship robes. She worked in the department that regulated magical creatures, so her work clothes weren't exactly combat gear, but they were close. Prepared as well as we could be, we went into the den, activated the fireplace, and flute-traveled to the Ministry of Magic. After a few moments of spinning through an incandescent void, we were spat out of one of many fireplaces ringing an immense underground atrium, each with an excellent view of a problematic golden fountain in the center of the room. I wondered how non-wizards felt when they had to show up and look at an immense idol that cast them as tiny support staff for wizards. Did non-wizards even get to come to the ministry? I couldn't exactly see a centaur using flute travel or taking the physical entrance from the London street above. The place was even more empty than it had been when I'd visited over a previous Christmas holiday, with no one there but the one security guard across the hardwood floor from our entry fireplace. I was a little nervous and barely remembered to check my long-legged stride so Mathilda could keep up as we crossed, footsteps echoing strangely in the room. Dresden, I got a summons, I explained to the guy, showing him my letter. And this is Mathilda Grimblehawk. She's with me. You're both on the list, the guy nodded. Let me scan you through. I blinked and looked at my girlfriend, who was as confused as I was. As convenient as it was that she was on the list, too, would they have just assumed I'd bring moral support? I gave the guy my unicorn horn focus, the closest thing I had to a wand, and Mathilda offered her own wand once mine was verified. He gave us temporary badges and pointed us to a nearby elevator, with instructions to go to the second floor, which, since the levels were basically labeled like sub-basements, and we came in on the 8th, was the second floor from the top. When we finally stepped off the elevator into the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, I sighed with relief that we were met by Alice Longbottom, one of our friends on the force. The small witch, still keeping her dark hair cropped short, nodded and said, "Glad you made it so fast. This is going to blow up soon." "Why was I on the list?" Mathilda asked the older witch. "Did you not get your letter?" Alice asked. "It must have gone to your parents' house. We'll have to get your address updated in the records if you're living with Harry." Well, that changed things. If they'd specifically called both me and Mathilda, there might be a few more individuals that we'd encountered together. And she'd never met Elaine, so it couldn't be my ex. I didn't really know how to feel about that, the short-lived anticipation of closure evaporating in a moment. "We managed to intercept a couple of Death Eaters that were moving the body tonight," Alice explained quietly, trusting us to follow as she walked to her left, over to a wing of the offices that seemed to be set up as a morgue. As we pushed into the room, it had the minimalist setup of drawers and tables that I'd expect from TV and movies, but of course, done in warm woods instead of metals, as was the common wizarding style. The place wasn't cold either, relying on stasis charms rather than refrigeration to preserve corpses. I have Harry Dresden and Mathilda Grimblehawk to identify the body, Alice announced to the other living occupant of the room. The man was tall and had a mane of light brown hair that was starting to grey, and he regarded us through a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles. I suppose I can expect this to make its way to Dumbledore almost immediately, he asked. His tone of voice was such that I couldn't tell if he was trying to warn us away from telling Hogwarts headmaster and the leader of the Order of Anti-Death, Ida Vigilantes, that Alice, Mathilda, and I were members of, or tacitly giving us permission. Then, like a muggle magician doing a trick, he quickly pulled the white sheet off of the cadaver on the table in front of us. Unmistakable, once no longer shrouded, was a body that I couldn't fail to recognize. It had killed me only a few weeks earlier. Somehow, inert upon the slab and dead like any other man, we were clearly looking at the semi-reptilian corpse of Tom Riddle, the theoretically immortal self-styled Dark Lord Voldemort. Hard body. No way. Well, that's convenient, Mathilda exclaimed, while I was still puzzling over the corpse of Tom Riddle. I'd pretty much expected him to go out in some climactic battle, killing several of my friends and allies before he finally went down, not to wash up, not a mark on him, in the local morgue. That the confirmation you need, Rufus? Alice asked the leonine man who was showing us the body. I'd seen the name Rufus Scrimgeour in the paper as the head of the Aura's office, so this was probably him. Hopefully he wouldn't ask me to pronounce his last name. I'd try to stick with Sir if it came up. Scrimgeour nodded, but said, "Let's get it all signed and sealed. Do both of you recognize this body?" Hedging a little, based on how political everything was, I answered, "That certainly appears to be the person or being that was created in the ritual we were kidnapped for on the night of April 25th. Transfiguration being what it is, I can't be certain." "Agreed," Mathilda said. "Still pretty scary, even dead. Is his skin actually scales? Is it wrong of me to want to touch it to see how that works?" Alice chuckled, and that even got a slight smirk from the taciturn-looking head Aura. "I appreciate the diplomacy. Certain parties will be quite happy to confirm that this individual is no longer running around, whether or not they want to admit to his identity." He thought for a moment, then said, "Your point about transfiguration is a solid one. We'll register your magical signature and get the unspeakables to analyze the body. If it was created using you as a component, it should have some of your magic on it. That would be a lot harder if this was a trick." Because I had trouble keeping my mouth shut when I thought of something, I asked, "Can they tell if he's been dead since the solstice, even with stasis charms?" The Death Eater attacks had suddenly quieted down toward the end of June, and if Voldemort had been killed around then, it would explain a lot. Scrimgeour didn't seem like he necessarily wanted to share information one way or the other, but finally allowed, "It's certainly possible that this occurred at a ritual gathering, and there may be more witnesses than the two we caught transporting the body. If you happen to come across any more as part of your private Aura's business, we'd appreciate them being sent to us to be properly interviewed." That seemed like tacit approval for the Order of the Phoenix to figure out what was going on as long as we kept him in the loop. I could work with that. I agreed. "Works for me, sir." "Let's go ahead and get you to the clean room for the scan," Scrimgeour suggested. "Third door on the right." As we were walking out, Alice whispered to Scrimgeour, low enough that even with my impressive hearing I could barely make it out, "Are you sure you can't lift the Doom? He's the most promising Aura candidate from his year." The head Aura replied, equally quietly, "Dawlish would run to Umbridge if I did, and she's not fond of him after the werewolf stunt." That about confirmed what I expected. I'd known I was basically giving up my chance to get out from under the Doom of Damocles when I'd helped scuttle Dolar's, Umbridge's anti-werewolf legislation a year and change prior, and I'd have done it again. But it still rankled that two useless and vindictive government officials were keeping me on magical Britain's equivalent of criminal probation, largely out of spite. Speak of the devil and he'll appear. As we walked down the hall to the room they kept clean of magical traces to better record individual signatures, We passed the bullpen of desks in the middle of the open space. I assumed it was where the auras filled out paperwork. The only one currently at a desk was John Dawlish himself. Not out in public, he'd left off the ratty tan trench coat in favor of red aura robes, but he was still recognizable by his Constantine knockoff blonde haircut and vaguely constipated look. "Fancy meeting you here, Dresden," he said, watching us go past. I was surprised he didn't immediately make a dig about me getting arrested. "Working late, John?" Alice asked, possibly cutting off the verbal fencing. "Don't want your arrests to fall apart because the forms weren't filed correctly," he suggested. "Those are a couple of purebloods you're holding. Longbottom can do her own forms," Scrimgeour told him. "I need you preparing the security for the World Cup." "Understood, sir." Dawlish nodded to the head aura, not seeming particularly chastised. "See you around, Dresden." When we got out of earshot, Mathelder asked, "Think he was here just waiting to get a dig at you?" "Probably," I agreed, which was why it was weird that he hadn't really said much. Maybe he was put off by his boss being there. After the scan, Alice escorted us back down to the lobby and put us straight through the flue to Dumbledore's office at Hogwarts. "Harry, Miss Grimblehawk, glad you could make it." The old wizard nodded at us, sitting behind his immense oak desk covered in magical contraptions, books, and piles of parchment. Alistair, Mad-Eye Moody, my boss partner, was already slouched in one of the chairs across the desk. The burly, heavily scarred man with graying red hair had his prosthetic leg propped out to take the weight off. His oversized prosthetic eye briefly synchronized with his real eye to take us in, and then spun back off to track the rest of the room, even through the back of his head. "I guess you already know they found Voldemort's body?" I asked, taking the last seat after Mathelder sat down. Alice hadn't followed us through, but she must have informed them before we showed up at the ministry. "And the Carrows moving the body," Dumbledore confirmed. "I've had Order members quietly keeping an eye on them for weeks, and it paid off." "The creepy brother and sister?" I asked. We'd been given a rundown of the Death Eaters at large at a previous meeting. It was especially galling that I was still on probation, while the dark magic incest twins had managed to stay out of prison like so many other purebloods after Voldemort died the first time. "Aren't they listers at best? Not bright or particularly dangerous compared to the rest of his inner circle, but they're loyal and used to smuggling bodies," Moody confirmed. "And they probably won't talk unless they can authorize Veritaserum." "Bet they won't," Mathelder frowned. She knew better than anyone what privileges the purebloods had, including needing extremely compelling evidence to justify magical truth serum. "They'll claim they were concerned citizens who found the body and were taking it to the authorities, right?" I asked. A whole round of nods agreed with my cynicism. "So we can't even get them to confirm that someone killing cursed him at their solstice party." "Go on, Harry," the headmaster asked. I explained. "I guess he could have been poisoned, and his body didn't have any obvious signs. Or I guess it was more violent, and the Death Eaters transfigured the body to make him look nice. Maybe they even screwed up the resurrection ritual, and it just stopped working all of a sudden, leaving a corpse. But he didn't have a visible mark on him, so the standard assumption is killing curse. With as fast as he was, it probably means someone he trusted cursed him in the back from short range while he was distracted. Chances are that they all know who did it." "Possibly not," Dumbledore disagreed. "My understanding is that they generally met robed and masked, at least during the war. It made it easier for each of them to protect their identities, or at least have plausible deniability. But it made it harder to be certain who was in attendance." Moody said, "I still think we should have tried to slip an assassin in during the war for just that reason. Sadly, Severus was unwilling, and they usually keyed their wards to the Dark Mark," the old man explained. "So, I agree with Harry that it's likely that a Death Eater did the deed, just not that we can assume the others know who did it." He sighed. "Not that he's likely to be permanently dead, though this may give us another respite." "You want us to track down the remaining Horcruxes?" I asked, though the headmaster winced a bit at me stating it so openly. At this point, Mathelder was already up to speed, even if she probably wouldn't be actively helping with the investigation. By us, I'd meant Moody and me. "And attempt to find out exactly what caused his apparent death," Dumbledore agreed. "This is likely to take up much of your new business time, so I'll pay for your hours out of the Order's funds. It's certainly a better use for the money than the impending war we've been fundraising for." Ideally, the remaining anchors can be cleansed before his followers can once again embody his spirit. Usually takes them about a year to get that done, I agreed. Though that was before he had all of his minions back together. I bet he didn't tell many of them how it works, though. Go get some sleep, Dresden, Moody told me. We'll hit the bricks in the morning. Sleuthsayer's apparition makes for really frustrating detective work. There are very few exciting foot chases when everyone involved can just teleport. If a person of interest doesn't want to talk to you, he can just pop away in a rush of imploding air. Sure, there are tracing spells to follow someone that teleports, but they take a lot longer than the couple of seconds concentration of apparating itself. Unless the person you're after is too weak to apparate more than once without taking a break, he'll just go a few places in a row and you'll never find him again. What I'm saying is that trying to track down Death Eaters to question them made for an aggravating week. We'd eventually settled on the good old-fashioned stakeout, or at least the wizarding equivalent, veiled in a corner near Nocturne Alley. I was never totally clear on why a significant fraction of magical Britain's foremost shopping mall was dedicated to the kind of crime alley you'd expect to include a memorial to the shooting deaths of Thomas and Martha Wayne. It made for a convenient place to keep an eye out for bad guys, though particularly since there was a weak anti-apparition ward over the entirety of the alley to try to convince people to use the defined egresses. Most powerful wizards could just cut through, but it at least made it a little hard for someone you'd buttonholed to just leave without a second thought. It would have been faster to rouse people in the seedy wizard bars deeper in the alley, but Moody had enough enemies that he'd have gotten cursed in the back within moments of going to one of those even before he'd retired from the auras and lost that backing. I, honestly, wasn't that far behind him as far as people who wanted to kill me went. So we decided to do a stakeout near the law-abiding parts of the alley, hoping to catch a Death Eater without an entourage. If you've watched stakeouts in the movies, you're missing a key drawback: sitting in one place for hours in the middle of summer. Also, we were under Moody's discount invisibility cloaks. They were nowhere near as good as Ran's artifact cloak, but they were better than my disillusionment charm, especially if you held still, and easier to maintain. But all day in the muggy London July, draped in a piece of old fabric, isn't exactly a day at the beach. Also, Moody was convinced that cleaning the things too hard would degrade the magic even further, so they were ripe enough that, without scent-masking charms, the invisibility wouldn't help. It didn't make them any nicer on the inside. At least, with the help of Severus Snape's custom privacy charm, we could talk while we waited. Our conversation diffused into white noise that blended into the general hubbub of the alley enough to not give away our position. "There's Fletcher again," Moody pointed out, giving a running commentary on things I needed to learn about watching people. "See the hitch in his step. He's got something tied to his leg, or in an inside, hidden pocket. It's not fragile, or he'd be even more careful. It's in the way of his stride, and he's worried about ripping it off if he bumps it too often. How would I tell that apart from favoring a leg because of a wound?" I asked. "Good question. Watch his face. He's not wincing as he steps on that leg, and even with a wound that doesn't affect the knee directly, you're more likely to limp than just hitch. A recent wound, yeah, you might get some similar behavior. But again, look at the face for pain. A man that's just been kicked in the bollocks will show it in more than just his walk. Plus, it's dung, so it's an easy bet that he's always got some contraband on him," I added. One of the biggest surprises about joining Dumbledore's Order of the Phoenix was that Mundungus Fletcher, Britain's most notorious bottom-feeding hustler, was part of the group, in large part for his seedier contacts. Should we see if he knows anything? Right. No small part of detective work is learning to recognize the regulars, figure what they're usually up to. And no, I already hassled him yesterday after you went home. We lapsed into silence for a while, just an apprentice detective and his mentor sweltering under stinky invisibility cloaks in an anachronistic outdoor shopping mall. "Do the bad guys even come out before dark?" I eventually asked. "The ones that don't have a warrant out," he confirmed, nudging me to call attention to who was coming around the corner. "There's no way he's going to tell us anything," I groaned, watching Lucius Malfoy promenading out of Nocturne Alley, ornate cane tapping along the stones, loose silk robes flowing as he walked, and long, near-white hair pulled up into a man bun in deference to the heat. To my great chagrin, the blood supremacist had become something of an ally over the last few years. Well, at least we both had the best interests of his son, Draco, at heart, so I couldn't really burn that relationship entirely to the ground, no matter how repugnant I found his views. Plus, as far as I could tell, as her brother-in-law, he was deeply involved in my godmother's fairy machinations, so probably didn't have a ton of time for his former Dark Lord in the first place. But there might be something in how he doesn't tell us. Pay attention, Moody disagreed, and I felt him stand and cancel the sound muffling charm. Taking his cue, and able to make him out fairly easily as his cloak struggled to keep up its camouflage while he walked, I moved to flank Lucius on his other side. We both slid out of the cloaks in reasonable synchronization, and Moody said, "Morning, Lucius." To his credit, Malfoy kept from jumping in surprise, but I spotted him move his hand to draw his wand from his cane before he processed who we were. I still thought having a wand cane was the most pretentious thing about him, and with so many other pretentious affectations that were saying something. I guessed, worried about getting jumped like Tom Riddle was, Mr. Malfoy. "Hardly," he growled, putting the cane back to its normal use and continuing to walk. But one doesn't exactly expect to be accosted from rather shabby invisibility cloaks in the middle of the market. "He's right, boss. They're pretty shabby," I responded. Not up to the Malfoy standards for skullduggery. Moody hadn't yelled at me yet about being sassy, but I figured he'd eventually say something if my tendency to run my mouth off screwed up his own conversational and combat strategies. Moody adjusted fine, though, and just agreed. Malfoys don't need invisibility cloaks for skullduggery. They just pay people to pretend they don't notice. As we walked and talked, the tapping of Malfoy's cane and the clamping of Moody's artificial leg made an interesting cadence on the cobblestones as we traveled further into Diagon Alley proper. I was, once again, without my staff, since it wouldn't fit under the cloak. I really needed to work out how to make a space-expanded sheath for it eventually. If he'd been carting his old boss body around, instead of the Carrows, the Ministry would have just quietly incinerated it with no questions asked. "Someone caught the Carrows with a body?" Malfoy asked, and if he'd been trying harder, I might have believed he didn't already know. But I could see a small smile on his face, as if he was enjoying this game now that he'd gotten over the surprise. He realized we were fishing for information. "You know, I never truly believed that they were under the Imperius, as I was, during the war. A shame the once laudable Carrow family has fallen so far. You're saying you didn't get an invite to their solstice party?" I asked. "We get so many party invitations, we simply can't attend all of them," he didn't exactly deny. He was basically a politician who'd learned not to directly lie from all the noble she fairies he was hanging out with, so there was no way we'd get a straight answer. "By the way, if you happen to make it to the World Cup next month, I'm sure Draco would like to see you at his pre-match party. Not you, Alistair, I'm afraid. You'll scare the children." "So you're saying you think it will be safe at the World Cup, enough to have a party?" Moody tried. The platinum-haired pureblood pretended to consider, and allowed, "Well, one can never predict what those frustrated at losing will do. Sporting matches are always at risk of hooligans and rioters, obviously. But if you're correct, the figurehead the terrorists were rallying around is a body in the morgue, yes, so it should be safe enough." I asked, "And if he doesn't stay dead like he didn't the last time?" "Ah," Malfoy smirked. "Albus can't simply assume that a problem is solved, and must continue to worry at it as he's done for over a decade. Well, in that case, I'm sure you know a few names that might have received party invitations that I didn't. The more prominent may be at the World Cup." He shrugged as if that was all he knew. "But if the two of you are struggling to find clients for your new private aura's business that aren't paranoid old men, I could perhaps find some more useful tasks for you to pursue." Moody broke first and growled, "We'll never take Malfoy money. I'll put it in the business charter if I have to." I was a little shocked that he lost the verbal fencing match that early, but I might actually have had more experience with that kind of thing than he'd had, with all the chats I'd had with various she and she allies. "Pity," Malfoy shrugged. "Well, if you'll excuse me," he gestured to the Quidditch shop he'd led us up to. "I've heard the firebolts might have come down to a less extortionate price this year, and Draco did well in his classes through the spring term. I know neither of you have much interest in racing brooms, so I'll bid you good day. Moody started stumping back to our stakeout spot, complaining, "One day I'll catch that jumped-up snake at something. I should have used more permanent spells when I faced him during the war." I chose to not comment that maybe he shouldn't try to verbally spar with Malfoy, and instead said, "He was definitely at the ritual, and is sure that Riddle is dead, right? Muffliato. True. But we don't know if he knows about the anchors," he agreed, recasting the privacy charm and slumping back down onto his box. He didn't put his cloak back on, since there currently wasn't anyone nearby, and his magic, spinning eye would theoretically spot anyone pulling the same trick we'd been using. But he's not sure the other Death Eaters won't try something at the Cup. If you get a chance for tickets, take it. I don't think we can wait a month for more leads, though. I hate to ask, but... Can you contact your godmother? I sighed. I can try, but she'll be even slipperier than Malfoy was. My godmother, Bellatrix Lestrange née Black, was Lucius' wife's sister and seemed to be masterminding the entire ferry plot that kept them from siding with Voldemort. She almost never gave me a straight answer, and when she did, I rarely liked it. "Owl her anyway," he ordered, and I nodded. "I'm tired of sitting out here. Let's get some lunch. After, we'll see if we can pick up side jobs that aren't Malfoy-funded in case we do have to wait for the World Cup to move on this one." He thought for a second. "Also, full moon tonight, so best to get behind wards just in case." "And it's Friday," I reminded him. "Right. Let's make the best use of the afternoon, then, so you can enjoy your weekend with your friends." Chapter 45, Holy Grail 2, Bad Cop. Chapter text Rage quit Penny sighed in annoyance, running a hand through her curly blonde hair. "So to sum up, we're trapped in a cabin, surrounded by vampires, and there's only the one way out." Mathilda nodded. "Windows are boarded up, no back door even. Can we think of any magic that would help us escape?" I checked. Penny argued, "Not that we can cast before they come storming in, and we'd need a mirror to escape using the veil." "Then we fight," Percy confirmed to our answering nods. "All right." I activate Razor Claws, then go ahead and transform into my war form before smashing out of the front. "That should shake them up. You both behind. Now is the time to rage. The rotten boards around the door shatter before your Lupin might," Mathilda narrated. "The vampires are surprised. They weren't expecting 9 feet of werewolf. Roll for initiative. That's our wits plus our alertness, right?" I checked as we all started picking out a fistful of dice, shaking them with a satisfying clatter. We hadn't wanted to continue our Arcanos campaign without the rest of our Gryffindor friends able to show up regularly. But a house with 4 late teens was a perfect size for a storytelling game of personal horror. We'd all been kind of against pretending to be vampires after our run-ins with them over the previous year. But a new edition of the role-playing game, where you got to play eco-terrorist werewolves, had recently been released, and that was exactly our speed. Mathilda had figured that the night of the full moon was perfect for our first session. I was looking forward to telling Remus about it later and seeing if he was amused or annoyed. We got about halfway through an enjoyable slaughter of undead fiends via the application of piles of 10-sided dice and Mathilda's narration before the fireplace flared green and Oliver Wood stepped through. He was Percy's and my former roommate, previous captain of our house's Quidditch team, and had taken surprisingly well to being a bunch of nerds' captive jock. "Sorry I'm late. Practice went long." He apologized in his heavy Scottish drawl, hefting a big growler bottle and a paper bag with oil stains at the bottom. "But I brought beer and fresh crisps from the 3 broomsticks." "Ooh, snacks," Mathilda forgave him. "Get set up. You can show up on the next combat round." Since he didn't live with us and was busy with his sports career, we'd honestly figured Oliver would miss more sessions than he made it to. So he was playing one of the mysterious Egyptian werewolves that could just show up when and where they were needed. Playing an Egyptian with his thick accent, we'd insisted he name his character after Sean Connery's Immortal from Highlander. "We're slaughtering vampires that thought they had us trapped," I summarized for him as he started setting out the food, and Mathilda handed him his character sheet. We were just using the couches and chairs in the den to play around the coffee table, though Mathilda planned to make us go over to the kitchen table if we ever needed to have a map for a really tactical fight. "They were, instead, inverted," Percy explained. "Inverted is like being surrounded, but from the inside." The only clue that my bookish friend was joking, rather than actually giving a real definition, was the slight smile he had when he said it. "Your turn, Penny," Mathelda called. "You've got two of them on you still." "I'll burn the rest of my rage for extra attacks," Penny shrugged, making a racket, shaking her pile of dice in a cup to keep them from scattering. "Take that, you blights upon Gaia." After initially making noises about playing a caster type, she gravitated to the Wonder Woman-style Greek tribe of all-female werewolves, and really seemed to be enjoying just getting to be a physical brute. At least she'd reined it in somewhat, and was basically the group's bard. Percy had immediately spotted a hole in the rules that if he played a warrior from the tribe of martial artists, who was born wolf instead of human, he'd have the highest starting scores possible. We might eventually have to have a talk about the dark road of power gaming if he kept playing RPGs, but he seemed to be having a good time ninja kicking evil in the face. Personally, once I discovered there was a tribe that was all grubby hobos, I never looked at anything else. I was having fun being the team's feral and gross mystic. I had a magic spirit rattle made of old bones of uncertain provenance. "You should save one tea question," Oliver suggested as he waited until he could join. "I think I can tell if someone's lying." He'd taken the judge archetype, which left the trickster role unfilled since we didn't have 5 players. I was half considering suggesting inviting the Weasley twins just to see what they'd get up to with trickster werewolves, or maybe Remus if he didn't think playing would be too on the nose since he'd been big into pranks when he was younger. "Good point," Percy smiled. "That will let me try the wrestling rules." "Oh no, not the wrestling rules." I laughed. Those were always more complicated than just hitting someone for damage. I started flipping through the book so I could explain how that worked when it got to his turn. There's a maneuver called Fur. I want to try that one on my turn." "What does it do?" Penny asked. "I still have an attack left." I skimmed the text. "Looks like it rips their fur or skin off so they're easier for someone else to damage." "Gross," she said with an appreciative tone. "What do I roll to do that?" I said, "Normal attack roll, but it looks like it uses 2 actions, sorry. You could hamstring with your last action." "And get vampire in my mouth." "No thanks. I'll just do a basic claw attack again," she shrugged. "This one's almost dead anyway." I was sure the storytelling game of personal horror was in there somewhere, but so far it was playing out like Arcanos, only we were werewolves. I resolved to be all woe is me about my inner beast the next time we were in civilization, to really amp up the role-playing. Ultimately, we did wind up managing to wrestle one into the dirt for Oliver to question, and that led us to the lair of a vampire businessman who was bribing the city government to ignore illegal chemical dumping in the river. So we slaughtered another building full of vampires and called it a good session. I even got to choose scenery about my overflowing anger and shake my bone rattle at people in between good times. "So how's work?" Oliver asked as we were wrapping up. "If they told you they'd have to kill you," Mathelda answered for Percy and Penny with a smirk at interrupting Penny's favorite answer. "Harsh but fair," he chuckled. "You get to talk to each other about it at least." "For the most part," Percy allowed. "We may wind up on different projects and might not even get to share the specifics of those without permission from our department heads. Having fun, though. It's so great," Penny gushed. "Some of the things we study, I'd never have even known about it. Harry, you should have tried to apply, you'd love it." "If he could apply to the ministry, Scrimgeour would have him as an aura," Mathelda corrected. And now that she'd said it out loud, I finally knew how to pronounce the head aura's last name. My newt results had come back right after school ended, and I probably would have qualified for several departments if the Doom didn't put me on a total blacklist for ministry jobs. "It's cool. I'm doing what I love," I said, scrounging for clients and sitting under musty invisibility cloaks with Moody, trying to spot people in the alley. "Any luck on the special project?" Mathelda asked, since I hadn't had a chance to talk to her between work and the game. The rest of our friends were basically in the order at this point, to various degrees, but the Horcrux hunt was supposed to be more secret. Not that they hadn't all been there when we exorcised the first one. The previous year, we developed an exorcism charm, and Penny had used it to cleanse an artifact that Voldemort had used to house part of his soul and let him possess unassuming school staff. I answered We cornered Lucius Malfoy today, and he suggested the best place to catch and question other Death Eaters would be at the World Cup parties. But that's a month out, and we don't have tickets. Ha! I kin help W that, Oliver said. My team gave out comp tickets. I didn't think you'd want to go, but they're yours if you want them. Enough for everyone, I asked. We are already covered, Percy demurred. My father managed tickets for the whole family and Penny as well. Then plenty for the 2 OU, Oliver nodded. Any chance I'd still pass on the gift was cancelled by the excitement in Mathilda's face, even though her favorite team, the Chudley Cannons, were so bad that they'd probably never make it to a World Cup. Thanks, man, I accepted. That would be great. It still didn't help us investigate for the next few weeks, but at least I had a useful reason for going, on top of keeping my girlfriend happy. The Quidditch World Cup had to at least be more interesting than a school match, right? Muggle Beta, my godmother's, let her read. I'm not available to meet at the moment, but I've included copies of pages from a book about resurrection rituals. I hear there's been a rash of robberies from Muggle jewelry stores in London that might be a good source of revenue for your new business. Since I hadn't asked her about resurrection rituals or job leads when I'd mailed her about a meeting, her response seemed like a not-so-subtle attempt to give me information about what the Death Eaters were up to without having to answer direct questions. The pages she'd included seemed to be pulled from some obscure dark magic catalogue. Rather than explaining the exact ritual mechanics, they provided a one-paragraph summary. It was enough to identify the two I'd already been forcibly included in over the past 2 years. I felt a little better that she hadn't felt I was so dense that she needed to circle the one that referenced precious metals and gemstones. As much as I hate taking business advice from Bellatrix Lestrange, Moody grumbled, a few days after I'd received the letter, this is a pretty good investigation job. He looked strangely appropriate in his cheap Muggle suit, and had covered his constantly roving prosthetic eye with a basic black eye patch, not that it would likely impede its magical sight in any way. I was dressed up in my own cheap suit, and we looked every inch the grizzled pie and his new trainee. Third Eye Investigations, the stuffy, middle-aged Englishman asked as he greeted us at the front of his jewelry store. He then counted the number of eyes between the two of us and chuckled. Ah, I see. So do we, almost as well as if we had 5 eyes, I joked. It was technically even true with how powerful Moody's magic eye was. With my hearing, we could probably count about 5 ears as well. Quite, the manager said without affect, then continued on. Well, you come recommended, and the boys from the Met haven't turned up any leads. Our insurance provider is quite happy to provide a percentage of the value of any of the merchandise you recover. That's what we understand from the other victims, Moody nodded, professional. This was our 3rd stop, and at this point we were just confirming our suspicions. Since we're a new firm, we're willing to work on spec for this job, but for any future business we'll charge a retainer. Perfectly fair, nodded the man, happy to not pay anything this time if we didn't recover his jewelry. What can you tell us about the crime and what they took? Moody asked. The guy sighed. Video didn't record, alarms didn't trigger, and no obvious forced entry on the doors or the jewel safe. I'd honestly thought it was an employee, but they all were able to account for their whereabouts. I held out a metal contraption about the size and shape of a soda can and suggested, they're probably using something like this. We think these are the same people that hit a technology firm, and this is a prototype device that creates an EMP, an electromagnetic pulse. It can short out nearby electronics. It was no such thing, of course, just a technological-looking prop that Penny had helped me put together from scrounged parts. But telling him a wizard did it would break the statute of secrecy, even if he believed us. Oh my, I hope such a thing doesn't become commonly available. The man seemed to believe us just based on my fabricated explanation. Last place had asked for a demonstration, and I'd had to hex out their cameras while pretending to use the EMP grenade. It was for the military, Moody continued the story. They're obviously increasing security, so nothing like this gets stolen again. Well, that's something at least, the manager shrugged. The thieves took an assortment of valuable pieces. Perhaps most surprising was that they took the entirety of our collection of pieces with opals, while leaving some of the more valuable pieces. Mined in Albania? I asked, checking my notepad as if I didn't expect that answer. He got a bit of a surprised look and admitted, "Why, yes. Is that related?" "Seems to be common from the break-ins," Moody answered. "We're going to look into Eastern nationals. Might be related to organized crime out of the former Soviet Union." The man nodded. The story we'd cooked up certainly made more sense than dark wizards that needed gemstones from where their dead lord's spirit seemed to be anchored to use in a ritual to try to bring him back to life. "Do you know any other businesses that haven't been robbed, yet that might carry similar opals?" I asked. "Might give us a chance to catch this crew in the act." "I'll make you a list," he agreed. As we left the shop with the information, Moody put up a privacy charm and said, "They'll hit one of these tonight or tomorrow if they stick to the pattern." "Yeah, and based on the ritual summary, they need a lot of opals. They hopefully don't have enough yet," I added. "Looks like half a dozen good options across town. Can we put alarm wards up? Anyone competent would notice those and be gone before we could show up," Moody mused. "Most of them aren't competent, but I don't want to risk it's one of the smarter ones." He thought about it for a little bit, then suggested, "You and your friends have those message rings, right? What are they all up to the next couple nights?" It was surprisingly easy to convince Oliver, our other friend Alexis, and my roommates to split up and stake out the various shops that might be hit. I doubted it would be as easy to convince them a second time, once they all realized how boring it was to spend several hours, invisible, watching a door. At least most of them were better at veiling magic than I was, so they didn't have to be under the stinky cloaks. Without a messaging ring of his own, Moody was doubled up with Oliver, who he judged to be the most likely to get bored and stop paying attention. This assumption probably wasn't unfair. After Quidditch practice all day, Oliver might have decided to just find a nearby London pub and relax without Moody there to keep him company. Fortunately, my ability to convince my friends to do this again a second time in a row wasn't tested. The bad guys had decided to make their attempt that night, not long after midnight. My ring heated up to indicate a message, and I checked to see that it simply said, my location, 3 guys. We apparated into the prearranged spot for the shop Alexis was watching, some distance away from the store itself, so the bangs of teleportation wouldn't be obvious. Like most of the businesses in central London, it was a tightly packed storefront with no obvious way to get in through the back. As densely clustered as the block of shops was, there might not really even be more than a tiny courtyard in the center where employees could go to smoke. Fortunately, this late at night, the shopping district was basically deserted, which was why for their previous jobs the robbers had been mostly going through the front door, bold as brass. Moody started casting an anti-apparition jinx as soon as we were all present, then directed people to their places. While they were all more or less members of the Order, they hadn't all really signed up to have running spell battles with Death Eaters. So we had Penny and Percy on one end of the road, while Oliver and Alexis took the other, ready to cover us if the fight escaped the shop, or to magically confound any muggles that happened past. Mathilda, of course, had insisted on being with me and Moody when we attacked. I'd given up on trying to keep her from putting herself in danger to back me up. 2 in the back, 1 on watch. "Looks sloppy," Moody said quietly, pulling on his invisibility cloak and stalking like a ripple in the dark toward the shop. They'd hexed out all the nearby lights as they robbed the store, so the cheap cloak wasn't going to be obvious unless the lookout also had a magic eye, which seemed unlikely. Sure enough, a flash of red from my boss' stunning spell was the first sign that he had gotten into the shop. We assumed he'd hit his target, and Mathilda and I moved into the building from where we'd been standing out of view. I was busily charging magic into the glass globe I'd pulled from a pocket. As soon as we entered the shop, I could make out Moody, crouched over the fallen form of the lookout, having dragged him behind one of the glass display cases, currently empty of anything other than the cheapest jewelry. He held up 2 fingers and pointed their approximate location out to me. Having an ally that could see through walls was pretty unfair for this kind of fight. I worked out where the back room with the jewel safe must be from the dim light the item in my hand was emitting, moved into position, and tossed the globe in before the shifting light could alert the robbers. Quickly averting my eyes, I heard the smash of glass, and then the entire room was momentarily lit up and full of an extremely loud whine. One of the Death Eaters had used a flashbang grenade on Mathelder and me during my most recent kidnapping, and I'd worked out that making a one-use enchanted item to do the same thing would be easy. It was basically just an overpowered light charm with an added sound effect. After tossing the grenade, I put up a shield just in case of return fire, while Moody and Mathelder slipped behind me and started lobbing stunners into the room. One of the two targets seemed to take a couple of hits and be trying to move before he went down. If he hadn't tried to apparate away first, he might have gotten a spell off. The way the red light of the stunners had skittered off of him before one finally landed, I suspected he had some kind of enchanted protective clothing like I wore. The whole fight took only a few seconds. I was expecting a running spell battle through London, I observed. Some might have called it less observing and more whining. You can cause a bunch of collateral damage when you're not representing me too, Moody told me, or when I tell you it's justified. He reached down and pulled the Death Eater masks off of the two of them. Rookwood, I should have known, he said, regarding the one who'd had enchanted protections. Augustus Rookwood was the former member of the Department of Mysteries who'd been broken out of prison back in May. He looked gaunt still, and his hair was shorn close, with the dramatic widow's peak the sign of his receding hairline. "Who are the other two?" I asked. "Mulciber and Avery," Moody said, walking back into the main room and unmasking the lookout. Mulciber had been another escapee, and Avery was one of the Death Eaters that didn't originally go to prison due to pretending he'd been mind-controlled. "Call the Auras," I asked. "Not yet," my boss figured. "Let's take them to a safe house first." "I have questions." I shrugged, though Mathelder looked a little nervous. Hopefully Percy wouldn't protest. Was it bad that we'd already moved onto a little vigilante extraordinary rendition? Bad cop, perhaps the greatest reason why the magical world had held onto the statue of secrecy for so long was the legitimate worry about what would happen when Muggles found out about the powers wizards could hold over them. Confronting a powerful spellcaster on the battlefield is bad enough, but when one has time to plan and capture you, well, in particular, I was glad that Alistair Moody was on my side. The safe house he'd chosen for this interrogation wasn't under the Fidelius, but it had every other protection Moody could come up with. It would have been under the aforementioned ritual that made the building imperceptible to most people, except that he didn't want to rely on Dumbledore to control access, and apparently it did not so great things to the brain if you forced a prisoner into a location that was a magical secret their mind couldn't comprehend. At the very least, it made it hard for them to focus enough to be questioned. It didn't really matter if people could eventually find the place, because I was pretty sure Moody had several. This one was a dim, dank basement in a small, condemned house in East Sheffield. He'd magically expanded the space, put up all kinds of wards, particularly against apparition and sounds, and had dug at least one whole escape tunnel that reached 100 yards away from the property, in case someone tried to trap us in the building from outside. That he could do all that on his own with just basic transfiguration, magic, and warding know-how wasn't the scary part. The scary part was the interrogation in the space. We didn't need a fancy room for it. We could have done it in a field somewhere. Moody was incredibly paranoid, but the truth was that there was no way to detect magic across the whole of Britain. The trace barely worked, and it was specifically applied to minors. Most magical adults wouldn't put up with an equivalent. Even if they could detect magic in any random spot in the country, all we really needed was a small vial of odorless, perfectly clear potion, which wouldn't have been detectable inside the ministry itself. Don't get captured by a wizard. The smarter ones don't even need to torture you to get you to reveal anything you know. My friends had been sent home for plausible deniability, and I could tell even Mathelder was slightly happy about that. The less they knew for sure about the illegal elements of Dumbledore's vigilante undertaking, the less they could reveal if forced to take the Veritas room we were forcing down Rookwood's throat, while his co-robbers remained stunned, bound, and caged across the room. With 3 of my friends currently employed by the ministry, and Mathelder interning and hoping to work there as a career, being involved in this kind of thing was a more problematic hobby than most other extracurricular pursuits. Fortunately, Moody was retired, and Dawlish had banned me from ever working there, so it wasn't like they could fire us for violating our civil servant oaths. They could send us to prison, obviously, but that would at least be a fun trial when it came out that we were only doing illegal things to escape terrorists. What's your name? Moody snapped out, seconds after I'd revived the tied-up Death Eater and applied the 3 drops of truth serum to his tongue. Augustus Rookwood, the guy answered in a bit of a monotone, his head tilted as he tried to look around, but we'd blindfolded him. Where's the jewelry you stole? My boss followed up. It wasn't maybe the most important question, but he had an eye toward getting paid. Avery's manor, Rookwood explained. Moody and I shared a look. That made it a little more difficult to recover, but we'd assumed it would probably be stored somewhere that was tricky to break into and had a fallback plan. Who killed Voldemort? Moody asked. Rookwood hesitated a bit, finally answering, Severus Snape. I rolled my eyes. The problem with Veritasrum was that you could get around it once you realized what was going on if you were stubborn enough. Who killed Voldemort at the Death Eater gathering on the summer solstice a few weeks ago? I specified. The prisoner shifted a bit, trying to figure out another technical truth before admitting, I don't know. We were all in masks and robes. Who do you suspect? I asked. It had to be a marked member to pass the wards, he admitted, but I did not recognize the voice that cast the killing curse. I shrugged. That was at least a little more information. The tendency for the Death Eaters to meet in black cloaks and creepy masks like edgelords probably made it hard to tell people apart even before you threw in all the magic ways to disguise your shape and voice. But the magical tattoo they all got was harder to fake. It meant one of them had decided to kill their Dark Lord, and it was probably premeditated. We'd suspected all of that, of course, but at least now we had confirmation. Moody took back over. Do you know where Voldemort's shade is currently? No, Rookwood admitted. Do you know the location of his remaining Horcruxes? The captive tried to hold his tongue, or was possibly trying to pretend he didn't recognize the word before admitting, no. I couldn't help but ask, why were you putting together a resurrection ritual if you didn't have the subject? Others are seeking the master, he said, kind of lamely. It wasn't great that he didn't know anything, but it at least probably meant we had some time. Moody tried a couple of more questions to figure out more of what was going on, but with open-ended questions, Rookwood had an easier time giving unhelpful answers. The best we could figure was that all the Azkaban escapees had gone to ground and were periodically checking in with their allies who were officially cleared after the last war and couldn't easily be proved to be harboring fugitives. After we'd gotten what we could, Moody growled out, obliviate, to wipe the short interview from the man's mind, and then stunned him again. Want to try for the other two? He asked. Seems like he was the brains, I answered as I went ahead and force-fed him the antidote to the Veritasserum, just in case he woke before it was out of his system naturally. More risk of ruining the fallback plan if they all have signs of mind magic. Agreed, he admitted. Let's take them back and send for Tonks. The whole thing had only taken about half an hour from the time we caught them breaking into the jewelry shop. When we apparated back, the wizard-locked door hadn't been further tampered with, and the power was still hexed out. I was honestly slightly confused that the power outage hadn't triggered an immediate security alarm with all the robberies, but maybe Rookwood had figured out a way to hex out the systems that would leave them thinking they were still online. Placing the bodies back more or less where we'd initially defeated them, I sent a Patronus messenger off while Moody finished checking the scene for any evidence that we weren't being completely truthful about what happened. A few minutes later, a pair of robed individuals appeared in the same alley we'd used, checked for muggles, and then strode across the street to the store. The witch with bubblegum pink hair was obviously Moody's former trainee, also my buddy and the girlfriend of my landlord, Aura Tonks, and the dark-skinned man was Aura Shacklebolt. Both were also members of the Order, but were still employed as Auras. If the ministry as a whole wasn't already so corrupt, the conflict of interest would probably be staggering. I removed the spell locking the front door with my handy unlocking focus and let them in. Then we gave them an abridged and time-shifted version of what had happened, with both clearly understanding that we were probably not being completely honest. Moody finished up his explanation with, and you should probably check Avery's manor for jewelry that was stolen from other Muggle businesses. We can give you an inventory. If it's recovered, we'd appreciate it if we could return it to the owners. Frank's on the desk tonight, so I think we can push that through before any of Avery's allies object, Shacklebolt agreed. Do you want us to bury your involvement? Moody shook his head. Nah, might as well leave it in. Could be good for business if we already have a couple of captures under our belts, and they're swinging for Dresden already anyway. Not like he can piss people off more. Thanks, boss, I told him sarcastically. The formal part of the interview done, as Shacklebolt was arranging the prisoners for transport, I asked Tonks, how's cohabitation going? Not bad, she admitted, hair shifting to a warmer red as she thought about it. Since I was living in his house now, Remus was planning to stay with his girlfriend while school was out. The flat's a bit small, but it's just for the summer. I work nights enough that we're not really in each other's way, and I love coming home to him being there. It's going to be weird when he goes back to school full time. I know, I nodded. I'm just getting used to Mathilda being around. We're not sure what it's going to do to the house when she's not living there. At least you've only got one more year of it, she mused. Maybe I should look into getting a place in Hogsmeade. You could probably get the plot where the Shrieking Shack was for cheap, I suggested. The haunted house had burned down a couple of years prior when some other Death Eaters had tried to burn Mathilda and me alive, not realizing we were already safe in the secret passage. Open the passage back up, and Remus could sneak home every night. No more secret passages out of that school, Moody snorted, inserting himself into the conversation. Took me years and Albus being incapacitated to close the ones that were already there. I nodded carefully. My boss didn't need to know that I'd recently found out from a couple of twin troublemakers with a magic map that Dumbledore had already dug at least one new secret passage out of the school. He was incorrigible that way.